record to the cloud.
I don't think any of them were this morning.
Yeah,
I
they
set
did.
it to record,
They
so it
did.
should have been
Yeah, it was
recording.
recording.
Yeah, I just fixed it after the first talk. So
Oh,
we should be
okay.
good now. When you're done, whoever you're just going to actually close this.
Okay.
I'm gonna actually show you just so you know. So you can just close this like a normal thing. You can close this again.
Uh-huh.
And we'll just close his because it's, and then you can just go to the desk. This is just the regular desktop. Here's that Urban Birds. We'll just open Urban Birds.
Is
And then you
mine
can
in
pick
there?
the next one. They're all there.
Is mine in
140.
I can't read a thing that prints minuscule. I
Okay.
need a magnifying glass.
Okay. Well, I can stay and help
I
if we
can't see a
need
thing.
to help. Is there not a Zoom person here?
Yes, this
Can
is
you
her.
come and help?
Yeah.
Because you should be the one doing this anyway, not the moderator. So I'm gonna have his up, but are you familiar with Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have you trade places for just 1 second, please. So I'm gonna move yours real quick, all right? That way everybody's in the same place. Okay. No, it's no problem. I'm gonna put this in here. So
Okay, now I can see a little better.
I just did that and I don't.
They're having an issue in Farragut. Someone go figure out what's going on. They're good next door. They're all set and ready to go.
Okay. Just trying to for download so everybody's in the same. Urban Birds is this session. Okay, so now we're there. All right, so she's the first one. The Zoom is open.
Yeah.
It's recording. Everything's good to go. You just ignore that. So you're sharing through the screen right now. So you can just share open it from the PowerPoint, just like, and then you'll just close it, stay within the Zoom, it's fine, and open the next one. Does that make
It's
sense?
still sharing on the screen.
Yep.
There you go.
We're good here. Perfect. Okay, let me get out of y'all's way.
We started at 1:20.
Yeah. Is this your first slide? No.
This is the first line.
All right.
Okay. We're gonna start right on time.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
They're very strict about wanting everything on time.
Because people were like transferring from one to the other, so I get it.
So I have little signs for like 5-minute warning and 2-minute, and it's for 15-minute talk.
Okay.
So if you go over it, it's not long, just
Should-
trying to say.
I should be around 15 minutes. We should be good.
Good. I have. Yeah, that's my job. You can do it if you want. Okay, we are gonna resume our Urban Bird program. And our next speaker is Katrina Tual. She's gonna talk on Shore We Can, piping blower management in New York City.
All right. Thank you all for having me here. I'm Katrina Toll. I'm the Deputy Director for New York City Parks Wildlife Unit, and I'm here to talk to you today about shorebird conservation in Rockaway Beach. So when we think of New York City, we often think of an image like this. However, New York City also contains habitats like this, and I'm going to be talking about a very special part of this habitat, the Rockaway Beach Endangered Species Nesting Area. New York City Parks, as an agency, we manage 14 miles of beach. And so this is just one section of that 14 miles that New York City Parks is responsible for. To orient you a little bit, this is the section that I'm talking about. So this is New York City. We're zooming in on this peninsula. We're zooming in a little bit more. And this red box is specifically where I'm talking about. The point to the west, Rockaway Point, doesn't really exist in my eyes. That's not New York City Parks property. So I really can't speak to that, which is what I love to tell the community whenever they ask me about what happens over there with piping blowers. And so we split up this section of beach from beach 149 to beach 9. This is approximately 6.5 miles of beach into 3 different sections just for shorebird management. So we have Rockaway Beach, which is on this west end, Arbor and Edgemere, which is around like just over a mile, and then Far Rockaway over on the east. We really don't have birds in this Rockaway Beach section because it's a very heavily recreation used beach. So most of our birds are in this Arbor and Edgemere and Far Rockaway section. While we're looking at this map, I do want to draw attention to the fact that we have a lot of housing here on this peninsula. And so we have people who are renting or buying beach adjacent property, and they have the expectation that they'll be able to just walk down the block and get to the beach. But with the beach closures due to nesting shorebirds, that's not always the case. We have several species of interest that are nesting at this area. We have the federally threatened and New York State endangered piping plover, the New York State threatened species least tern and common tern. I have a common tern pictured up here. We also have species of special concern like black skimmers and American oyster catchers, which are down here. They're very charismatic, but they actually don't get any special protection in New York State, but they nest right alongside the piping plovers and we track them very closely. We also have a federally and New York State threatened plant species, sea beach amaranth, that grows right around the same section. I know I said a lot there. What's really important is that all of these species, it doesn't matter if they're federally threatened, federal endangered, New York State threatened, New York State endangered, they all get the same level of protection. They're all protected from killing or harassing these birds, and US Fish and Wildlife and the state DEC both provide guidance for best practices for managing their successful breeding. And so every year following that guidance from US Fish and Wildlife and from the DEC, we put up this very fancy symbolic fencing so that the birds can just nest successfully. We'll put this up. We give at least a 50-meter buffer around each nest. We have a very large volume of birds nesting in that Arbor and Edgemere section that I pointed out. And so we actually fence that off in advance of the birds arriving there. So before April 1st of each year, we fence off approximately 1 mile of beach so that the piping plovers can arrive to the beach and just start nesting without us having to set up additional fencing. They already have a nice protected area for them. This fencing is really essential when their eggs blend in directly with the sand. They're not making fancy nests. They're just putting a little divot in the sand and they are laying eggs right on the sand. And so this fencing is really essential so that people don't accidentally step on the eggs and so that the chicks can feed at the shoreline so that they can put on weight and then grow up and fledge successfully. So yes, we follow US Fish and Wildlife guidelines for this. Because of the large volume of birds and the large volume of people, we actually go one step above what US Fish and Wildlife recommends in their guidelines, and we close off the shoreline so that there's no pedestrian access once the piping plover and tern chicks hatch out. To give you some quick biology about these birds so that you can see why we manage in this fashion, I'll give you a quick information about piping plovers and common terns. So piping plovers on this top row, and this is a mixture of common and least tern pictures on the bottom. So piping plovers are arriving in April. When they hatch out, they're able to walk around within just a couple of hours of hatching. So they're off finding their own food. Mom and dad are nearby, but the chicks are really mobile and they're walking, they're spending a lot of time at the rack line. So where the seaweed gathers right above where the water is coming in. So they spend a lot of time at the shoreline, which is why we close the shoreline off to pedestrian access. The chicks and the eggs depend almost exclusively on camouflage for their survival against predators. I showed you the eggs already, they really blend into the sand. The chicks, when a predator or us humans, which are perceived as predators, approach, they'll just freeze. The adults do what's called a broken wing display. And so the adults will fake a broken wing and try and lure a predator like a human or a fox or a raccoon away from the nest and from the chicks. So they're really like passive, docile, cute, adorable species. Versus we also have the terns. When the chicks hatch out for the common and least terns, they just lay there like a lump for 2 weeks while their parents come in and feed them fish. So this one actually has fish in its mouth. And so they were just on the ground for 2 weeks. And they really depend on their parents for protection. So common and least terns are the original angry bird. They will dive at intruders, they will poop on them. I have been hit in the head directly by a bill from one of them. Like, these are very aggressive birds. That's their only protection from predators. And it's really effective. We've had issues where raccoons have been eating eggs for weeks, and then all of a sudden when the terns come in, the raccoons disappear. The terns will scare them out. And so these are kind of different birds, but they're nesting in the same area and get the same level of protection. So we have a team of 4 seasonal monitors that are out there pretty much every day. They're out there right now. When the chicks hatch out, we switch over to 7-day-a-week coverage, and our seasonal monitors, they'll keep track of every single plover egg that's laid. They'll count all of the terns. The terns nest in a big colony, so a big group of terns, and they'll count each individual tern as we go through. And they actually take GPS points at all of the piping plover nests and all of the oyster catcher nests. We have so many oyster catcher eggs that I actually excluded them from this map, otherwise it would really fill it in. But this map shows all of the piping plover, common terns, and least tern nesting that we had last summer. So we have, each dot is a piping plover, and then we kind of just drew in circles for the common terns and least terns. One of the things that I'm constantly telling the community is, like, remember that we have common terns and least terns. They take up the majority of this nesting area. They're really aggressive. They make the beach and the shoreline not a fun place to be when these birds are nesting there. So you can see that we have most of our birds nesting in this Arverne Edgemere site. So this is 1 mile from beach 38 to beach 57. But we also fenced around these 6 nests in Far Rockaway. We'll put up that fencing as birds arrive to the site and start nesting there. We just do a 50-meter buffer around those birds. There's way fewer of those birds, and this is also not a super popular section of beach. And then you might also notice I have a couple of dots over here. That's American oyster catchers. They don't get any special protection, and so we just put up a little like 10 by 10 foot fencing for them so that we're not accidentally stepping on their eggs. And as I mentioned before, we do close the shoreline down to pedestrians here and here, so that pretty much around Memorial Day, we end up having to do that each summer. And so starting around Memorial Day, when the chicks start hatching out, we don't have pedestrian access in that area, so that the birds can all just feed at the shoreline. So those are the birds. We also have Sea Beach Amaranth, as I mentioned before, this cool looking plant, and it pretty much grows wherever we put up symbolic fencing. So the symbolic fencing, it's put up primarily for the piping plovers, but you can see that we have other species that are really benefiting from it as well. And this is a federally and state listed species. Last summer, we had 21 pairs of piping plovers. That was a lot of pairs for this area. This is pretty much what we've been having since like pretty much post Hurricane Sandy. Even though we had a lot of pairs, we didn't have great productivity. It was the lowest productivity that we've had since Hurricane Sandy. I use that as a benchmark because the beach really changed after Sandy. And so we didn't have the productivity rate that we're hoping for. We usually try to aim for a 1.5 chicks fledged per pair. That's the US Fish and Wildlife recovery goal. We only reached 0.24 chicks per pair. There's a lot of different factors that can impact productivity. The ones that we as managers can impact are like vegetation density, predators arriving to the area, and also human disturbance. That's really what I try and focus on. We had the least and common terns arrive starting in May. We do 2 counts to report to the state. We did those both in June. So this year we had like 100 least terns and only like 25 common terns. But in the past, we've had varying amounts. So one year we had around like 2,000 birds in total for the common terns and least terns. So it can vary a lot. So one of the things that impacted our productivity this year was that we had a major act of vandalism that occurred. So our staff got to the site one day and they discovered almost every single nest was destroyed. So all of the nests that were from the boardwalk to a dune were all destroyed. So those are highlighted in pink. We also found a sweatshirt which had egg yolk on it. We found a dead piping plover adult, which we're very confused about because they're kind of hard to approach. It was submitted to Fish and Wildlife and the DEC as evidence, so they'll do a necropsy on that. But yeah, someone came in and pretty much destroyed every nest that they could see. It was really heartbreaking for our staff to see. And it was kind of, it's heartbreaking for me as a manager to think that people can do this. That was mostly American oyster catcher nests. So except for one piping plover nest, those were all American oyster catcher nests. They're really resilient. So they all re-nested and they had a decent productivity last year. We also had another incident though, where people had tents in the site. They were setting off fireworks. They had a generator. They had beach towels out, and they walked over a piping plover nest. But all of that partying overnight moved all of the terns. So the terns left our site completely. They came back a couple of weeks later, and it really delayed their breeding. And so we weren't able to open up the shoreline until August 11th because the birds were really disturbed and then came back and had delayed breeding that year. So even though we had that harrowing vandalism, it's really nice and uplifting to know that the majority of people actually support the work that we're doing. And we know this because we went out there and we surveyed people on the boardwalk. We worked with social scientists at the urban field stations so that we know we had an accurate survey. And overwhelmingly, people are telling us that it's important to them to do shorebird conservation. It's important to them to close off the beach for shorebird conservation. When we did this survey, we did it twice in 2019 and 2022. So last summer, we had 50% of our respondents were people who actually live in the peninsula. So that's what we're really aiming for, is to like ask people who are living here and who are impacted by our shorebird beach closures, what they feel about the shorebird closures and the shorebirds. And so overwhelmingly, they like what we're doing. But we definitely have some loud voices that are saying that what we're doing is unfair. We have local elected officials, the local civic association asking for more beach access. While we provide protection for these shorebirds, we also do a lot of public engagement so that we can hopefully bolster our support of our work. We have our famous piping plover mascot that we have out at events. We do a Celebrate Shorebirds event. We also do some talk writing. So we did a bunch of messages on the boardwalk about all of our birds. We might not have P22, but we do have Tutu-J, who is our breeding male. He's come back 5 years in a row. He was a really great parent. And so we had a lot of talk messages about him. We involve students in this. So this is local students that are coming out to do these shorebird art murals. They also created these really awesome signs. And so we partnered with New York City Audubon, New York City Plover Project, and the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy to go into schools and teach them about sharing the shore. And then students made these awesome signs that we put up all across the boardwalk. So we're going to be continuing to do our outreach like this. During the pandemic, we really beefed up our online presence. And so we Parks posted every Wednesday for #Wildlife Wednesday. We highlight the piping plovers whenever we can. We share really practical things for tips for coexistence, but we also do some fun messages to make the shorebirds more relatable to pop culture and to New Yorkers. We've gotten really positive feedback from these posts, and we can reach a lot of people really quickly with them. So that was my brief overview of the conservation and engagement work that we're doing, and I could take any questions now.
We have time for 3 or 4 questions.
What's your plans to stop, like, to kind of like combat the vandalism that's happening in these areas besides just like public outreach and engagement? Like, is there any way that like you can like the camera to like hold someone that's like coming in and purposely like destroying or partying on this conserved area?
Yeah, so following the vandalism incidents, under guidance from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we did put up some more trail cameras so that we could see if it was like a very targeted, attack on these birds, if they came back and did the same thing. We're really not having a lot of people come in and do that targeted vandalism. We're seeing just people walking through the site to cut through to get to the ocean, or walking through the site with their dog. So we have put some cameras up and like increased signage. Yep.
So in Connecticut, they don't close right along the water line. They like to leave a little walking path for people to walk along the water, even though they close off the rest of the beach. I'm trying to understand from a piping plover's perspective, the difference or how they're being affected by that.
So we have piping plovers breeding in a a couple of different areas and they're all treated very differently. What's special in the area where we close off the shoreline, we have a lot of turns there. And so you have birds who are getting very agitated very easily. In other areas, like in our Far Rockaway section, we're not doing the whole shoreline closure. And the birds can just like retreat into their little symbolic fence area if the beach gets too crowded. But when you have a bunch of terns jumping up and getting angry, it's really disruptive to the plovers in that section. So that's why we close it
So
off.
the turns, not necessarily.
It's the people, yeah,
The need, or create the need.
yeah. Yep.
I couldn't tell from the photograph, is your exclusion fence single strand with flyers on it, or do you do anything to exclude raccoons and cats with a lower wire?
So normally we just do 2 strings up top, really as a visual barrier to people. We started this year doing fence, like cage exclosures in this area. We did that after talking to US Fish and Wildlife. Vandalism, when you have an area with a lot of vandalism, it can actually attract more vandals. In the past, we have put up like fake exclosures and immediately cats will come right up to it. So depending on how sensitive your bird is to cats, that can actually like then abandon its nest because of that. So it is really tricky. Different sites use different things about whether or not they want to do the cage exclosures. Yep.
So there's obviously a couple of different species there. Is there any interspecific competition for nesting sites, or do they sort of split up the beach?
So we've actually worked with New York City Audubon to study where American oyster catchers are nesting in relation to piping plovers. I don't have that data right off of the top of my head. We also have looked at like aggression between piping plovers and the American oyster catchers. And while we have had documented instances of oyster catchers killing plover chicks or oyster catchers destroying plover eggs, for the most part, the negative interactions are like plover versus plover. They're like very territorial amongst each other. All right, thank you.
Local behavior and urban awareness.
Some of the ones like it.
That's it. Work out perfect.
Okay, our next speaker is Darren
Propane.
Propay.
Yes.
Very nice, okay. And he's gonna talk on local behavior and urban avoidance in golden cheek warblers inhabiting ex-urban preserves.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who has stayed for the afternoon session. I've seen some really cool titles this conference. I don't think I'm going to win in that category. It's a little bit long and awkward, but I'm trying to take 2 studies and sort of strangely pack them together here. So we'll be talking about golden cheek warblers and urban impacts. Couple of shout outs before I get started. St. Edward's University, Wild Basin is where I work in Austin, Texas. We're part of a grander group of preserves called the BCP, and several of them contributed data to this project as well. So golden cheeked warblers, it's an endangered species. It's listed federally and it's listed in the state of Texas. It was listed in 1990. Breeds exclusively in Central Texas, so we get excited about golden cheeked warblers down there. And then in the winter heads down to Central America in the mountains of Guatemala and other places, which I haven't seen yet. And I think that it's really important that I should as part of the, this research. But anyways, they arrive in our area in March, early March. It varies by a couple of weeks each year. And they will stay till July. I probably should say July-ish in there because that date is quite variable as well. But they utilize our ash, juniper and oak forest, and they will actually build their nest out of the bark, that's sort of a stringy bark from mature ash juniper. So it is a required tree in their habitat. So the golden cheeked warbler recovery plan was published in 1992. They took the breeding range of the warbler and they broke it into 8 different sections. And in order to consider delisting the species, they're looking to have a self-sustaining population with habitat that could sustain that population in all 8 of those particular regions. So the work that I will be talking about was done in Region 5, which is where Travis County lies, which is where the city of Austin lies. So an area that has developed pretty extensively. So because of the development that we saw in our region in 1996, they developed a habitat conservation plan called the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, which you see here. And this is 30,000 plus acres of land that has been set aside for the golden cheeked warbler, as well as some karst species. So the area that I work is one of these properties in red here, and that is the Wild Basin Wilderness Preserve. I put it both in the map of the Canyonlands as well as in a map of Austin to give you a little bit of perspective, but Austin has seen a lot of development over recent years. So what you're seeing there on what is your right is impervious surface. So as a representation of urban development. This is impervious surface in 2001 in Austin area. This is 2011. This is 2019. So what's interesting that even though the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve has set aside some pretty large tracts of land, they start to look more and more like islands amongst this development. You can start actually picking out where some of these preserves are. So this leads us to one of the studies that I wanted to discuss today, and that is asking the question, is increasing urbanization going to potentially affect the use of the Balcones Canyonland Preserve or the general Austin area for golden cheeked warblers? So to give you an example of this increase of urbanization, this right here is Wild Basin where I work. So that's 227 acres. What you can see is on the western side of the preserve, it's got a pretty high use highway, which has had more and more traffic over the years. And then it's ringed by housing, otherwise some high density and some low density. So we've seen a pretty big change over time in the development around Wild Basin and a lot of these different areas. So to figure out if this is having an impact or may have an impact, we took advantage of some data that the city of Austin and Travis County have been collecting since 2009, I believe. They do work on intensive plots every year. So they have biologists that will go into these plots and spot birds and follow birds throughout the season. They follow nests as well. So they're actually getting pretty incredible data set on what's going inside of these plots. What you see here is the plots from 2019. We found 10 plots that ran in both 2000 or in all of 2011, 2013, 2016, and 2019. And we use that because there are also data available on impervious surface from the National Land Cover Database for those particular years. So what this looks like, this is Wild Basin again where I work. This is all the observations of warblers that were done by the city and county during their surveys, in this case in 2013. So we took that data and we overlaid it with a grid. So it's a 100 meter by 100 meter grid. And then we also overlaid it with impervious surface. So to answer the question, then what we did is we said, okay, within every grid cell for each of those 4 individual years, how many warbler observations were there within that cell, and how much impervious surface was around that cell within a kilometer of the centroid at that particular year. So our model comes out telling us it's pretty significant as far as the relationship goes. So this is probably my takeaway graph here today. 0% impervious surface, you're pretty likely to see on one of these plots a golden cheeked warbler. In fact, the confidence intervals say you may see up to 8 over this season. But if you go to only 10%, so that's still pretty low impervious surface, it goes down to almost 0 probability of seeing a golden cheeked warbler on those plots. So that tells us that this is obviously pretty important. They're very much going to be using interiors. And a quick shout out to folks at Calvin, some students and faculty who helped with this analysis here. To let you look at Wild Basin, one specific site here, there's 2011, you can see up through 2019, there's different dots there that represent the likelihood of seeing a bird, a golden cheek, any of those particular spots. You can see visually here that it decreases over years, and it also seems like there's a little bit of shift away from the highway. Okay, this is anecdotal at this point. In fact, One interesting thing is that this year we had golden chutes everywhere on our property. So if I was to show, I don't have a map for this year, it would actually look quite different. It would look very much increased. Of course, the question for us is that a win? We hope so. There's some of them reproduced well, but we also lost a lot of habitat around us in the last year. So could it be that we're seeing more birds that are using it as a refuge? And that is yet to be seen. One of the takeaways from this, though, there's tons of development going on in Austin as in many urban areas, and a lot of them are developing in ways that can be pretty helpful, but they're doing things like green belts and put hiking trails in through the neighborhoods. And while I'm all about that, I'm an advocate for that, but we have to recognize that there's probably not habitat in most cases for the golden-cheeked warbler because it's going to be too close to this impervious surface for them to most likely utilize those habitats. And you know, the Balcones Canyon Land Preserve, which you see again here, has a lot of big tracts of land. That's obviously come out to be really important, but on those smaller tracts, we may have to think about how we create buffers around those landscapes if we're going to keep warblers using those. Okay, I told you there was 2 projects, so I'm going to shift gears here because these same biologists for the city of Austin that have been working for years on this landscape came to me a few years ago and said, hey, these guys sound different. Can you do a study? Can we look into this to see what's going on with their song? And I said, yeah, absolutely, let's do that. But what was even better was they had a person who was a graduate student at the time that recorded these birds in 2008 to 2010 on the Balcones Canyon Land Preserve. So we had some historical, semi-historical data that we could compare to. So we went out in 2021 and 22, and we did the same thing. We recorded a bunch of birds on the preserve, and we tried to record in the same locations if possible. For some reason, in some cases, we couldn't use the same spot, so we tried to be close by, but we recorded a number of golden-cheeked warbler males singing over that period of time. Now, the song system for golden-cheeked warblers is primarily an A song and a B song. They function differently. I'm not going to get into all the function here, but the B song is one that typically is more variable. And this is the one that the biologists had noted seemed to be changing. So I'm going to focus on the B song for the rest of the talk here. And that's the one you see here below. So this is sort of a breakdown of how we try to analyze this. It was not all that easy to figure out how songs had changed over time, because when they change, how do you create a standard within which you can capture that change? But this seems to work reasonably well. We broke it down into different types of notes. So what you see here was trill, and trill was a repeat. So there's a repeated syllable, but with space between, you can sort of recognize, or maybe you can say you could count the number of repeats. A buzz is a repeat where you really can't count it. It really sort of blurs together. You've got tones, so sort of a flat sound, a tonal sound. And then down on the bottom here, you can see you have what we call DS and US, or down swoop and up swoop. And those were like little hangers, either decreased in frequency or increased in frequency. So these were the notes that we saw in those songs we could analyze. We also looked at position. So in other words, we've seen different notes in different places in the songs over time. So we looked at position 1 to 5. In several cases, a position would have more than one note type. So if you look at position 3, for example, it has a tone and a buzz. And so for analysis, we would just call that 3A and 3B, so that positions could have multiple note types in them. So I was going to play a golden-cheeked warbler song for you, and I don't think it's going to work. It's very, very quiet. Okay, you could hear it. That's good. I could, but I'm not going to. All right, I'm glad you could hear. I thought eBird was going to shut us down because, you know, it might get reported that someone heard a golden-cheeked in Washington, D.C., and we all be in trouble. So, all right, you can sort of hear a golden-cheeked warbler. That is their B song. That's what it sounds like. If you could tell, there's some trills and some buzzes in that song. So what we did is we counted these different note types. How many trills do I see in a song? How long are they? And how much of the song do they comprise? And very briefly, what we saw was that trills went up. So our new songs, if you will, had a lot more trill notes than they did previously. Buzz, tone, and up swoop all decreased in our newer songs. These were all statistically significant, so we could argue that yes, there is definitely a change in these songs over time. Now let's look at the position of these notes as well. So here I have sort of a standard, a song that's a typical song from 2008 and one from 2021. And I'll use this to walk you through this. So these different positions. First of all, in position 1, where the arrow shows here, Used to be almost, it was mostly buzz in the songs that we analyzed, and you see now it's almost a 50-50 shift over towards that trill. In position 3 was the second place we saw differences, where you did not have much in the way of a buzz in the 2008 to 10 timeframe, but now you do. They're shorter, but there seems to be more of a presence of these buzz notes. And then lastly, in position 4, there was almost a complete shift from going from buzz notes to trill notes. So if you know Buick's wrens, these birds start to sound a little bit more like a Buick's wren now. They have a little more of a trill sound to them. So we're able to show that there was changes in the song, but the question would be why? And I can't answer that. So I can only speculate on some potentials that might be causing that today. So the first one is habitat. So birds tend to sing in ways that will maximize transmission of their songs in the habitat in which they reside. If you're in an open habitat, a buzz does particularly well for transmission. If you're in a closed habitat, a tone does better. So our habitats over time, we have let ash juniper grow back in a lot of these areas, and so they perhaps have become more closed or uniform than they had been previously. Might that trill actually transmit better than in these type of forests? I don't know, but I do know that a study on white-crowned sparrows showed a similar relationship where trills did best in a uniformly dense forest. So it could be that habitat is driving this, but again, that's speculation. Another option is dialects and movement. So in 2020, Drew Finn did a thesis and broke the breeding range into 3 different areas, north, central, and south, and found that, yes, in fact, there were different dialects in these areas. And these are sort of the standard, the typical bee song from each area that they found. Now, we sit in that central area in Travis County, and so that would have been their typical song. But if you notice the southern song, that is the one that actually has that trill in the 4th position there. And so it's possible we could be getting some movement between regions. But again, we don't have a lot of data to know if that's happening. And the last one I want to address is just random change. Right? Sometimes you get a song that's random and it's preferred and it moves throughout the population. So there was a bird called Piccolo that sounded apparently very tonal that appeared a few years ago. In this case, it didn't catch on to the rest of the population, but it was an example of the song that sort of popped up. There's another example down in Bexar County where several birds started to sing an odd song as well. So to conclude, there's still lots of ifs and lots of questions out there, but what we can say is that it does appear that in our region, the songs of the golden cheek warbler, the bee song, is changing over time, and we definitely see that there is an aversion to impervious surface. And so with that, I'll stop and take questions if there's time. Thank you.
Do you have any measurements of song before and after where maybe habitat hasn't changed so much, or where maybe, you know, I was thinking there was going to be like a link maybe to where impervious surface has changed or not changed, and that maybe you'd be linking some of the song changes to that, but could that be a way to kind of explore some of the mechanisms of change where maybe some of the habitat hasn't changed so much that you have a kind of before after?
Absolutely. So habitat changes are ways to investigate urbanization or areas where it hasn't changed. And that's definitely a follow-up study, right? We have these different mechanisms and we need to start exploring them. So step 1 was just to figure out, are we seeing the change? But then second is to go into those mechanisms. So, you know, I can envision much of the southern part of the range is more remote. There's not as much development. And so we could look at those habitats and see if there's differences based on urbanization. I will say as a quick note, we measured frequency in these as well. And frequency actually decreased in both trill and buzz notes in our 2. Yeah, it got lower in pitch. And so, which fits your vegetation hypothesis, right? But doesn't fit as much of what we think of as an urbanization is in terms of anthropogenic noise, because that often drives things to a higher frequency, and we saw the opposite. So that was one of the reasons I moved a little bit more towards that vegetation hypothesis as well.
This is a wild speculation, but since they're neotropical migratory birds, is it possible that during various years, the subpopulations in different areas with different dialects are migrating to your preserve with different songs?
It's certainly possible. So there is some research, and this is ongoing with genetics, showing that there are distinct subpopulations amongst the breeding range. And so the gene flow between those may be somewhat limited. So that would suggest that it's not just a free flow of birds that are all mixing within these areas. But having said that, I would imagine that they are probably congregating in similar areas on their winter ranges, and we certainly could see some overlap, especially if we have areas that are just functioning better for survivorship and productivity than others, right? There are some studies in the Austin area showing that our populations are relatively stable. And so we're not operating as a major sink. You can imagine that could be a way you would be drawing birds in. It doesn't appear that that's what's happening, but we could still be getting movement.
The impervious surfaces around, how is that impacting? And like, I know it decreased, how often we see them where they're nesting, but would the main factor be like tree growth, like how large trees are for them?
So yeah, so impervious surface is often used as a proxy for urbanization. That's kind of what we were going at. So there's a lot of things that go along with that, right? So you're going to have reduced tree cover, you're going to have higher human numbers, human populations. So it's what we chose to sort of represent urbanization. So absolutely, I agree with you. You're looking at a lot of associated components that would go along with that increased impervious surface. Yeah.
Still have a couple minutes.
I must have talked too fast. I blew through that, huh?
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Wait just a minute or so.
I don't like to get talk long, so I don't have.
Maybe
I'm gonna be raised on, so I get mine, so
just a couple minutes, so.
might be better. She did, yes. Just fabulous. Graduated as already off for the PhDs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I worked at Cal. She used to.
She showed up in Connecticut, the birding community. Didn't take them long to notice that there's a new birder in town who was outdoing them in the field.
Definitely one of those students that start training birds and whatnot. I'm sure.
Yeah, oh my goodness. My husband was trying to teach Cassie, but my husband started her field work again, like. I'll talk on. So let's
I
go
think
ahead.
it's close enough.
Yeah.
All right, our next speaker is Tracy Rittenhouse, who's going to talk about mallard nest survival, brood movements, and habitat use in urban Connecticut.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Tracy Rittenhouse. I'm at the University of Connecticut, and it is my pleasure to be talking about Laura Dykstra's master's work in my lab. She did a fabulous job and is already off to her PhD in Montana, and therefore not joining us here today. And then also to give a shout out to our collaborator at the state agency, Min Wong, who really was foundational to this project. What button do I click? The arrow? Yes, okay. So today we're talking about mallards. They're a very common species today, and they were common prior to European colonization. That doesn't mean that they were always common. There was a period of time where populations dropped pretty low. That was due to market hunting. And so populations dropped in the Atlantic Flyway. And therefore, we created wildlife laws. Those laws have been very effective, and we regulate hunting now. And mallard populations increased pretty rapidly in the 1950s and through the 1970s. This is their current breeding range. The prairie pothole region is the bread and butter for mallard reproduction, and that's where the vast majority of the research has been done. We know a lot about mallards, so much so that the book came out, Make Way for Ducklings, in 1941. So we all know that they're urban wildlife, right? The traffic will stop for mallards when they cross the road. But we also have some research on mallards, most of it from the prairie pothole region. But in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, there was a good amount of mallard work in the upper Northeast. And this was done because we were concerned about American black ducks, a closely related species that's much more rare. And so therefore, people were studying mallards to see if they were outcompeting black ducks. What we basically find, if I were to summarize the literature from this period of time, is to say that nest success and duckling survival in the Northeast in the 1990s and early 2000s was roughly similar to the reproductive rates that were coming out of the prairie pothole region. We can dig into that in a little bit more detail and say that most of that research was done in boreal forest. It was mostly done in agricultural places in New York. And the few studies that were done in more urban places did find novel things, novel nesting sites and lagoons in urban parks, in coastal islands in Chesapeake Bay, basically demonstrating that mallards can nest in lots of different places and that that urban parks were benefiting in mallards, particularly their overwintering survival. But mallards, we also learned a little bit about mallards nesting away from urban parks, but raising their broods within urban parks. Remember, this was the 90s, where doing kernel estimation for home range estimation was new. Having a handful of animals with collars on them and getting 50 relocations was the gold standard of wildlife data at the time. So why are we talking about mallards today? Because they're a game species, the Atlantic Flyway has waterfowl biologists that do annual surveys in all the states. And this gives us numbers, and there is a long-term trend, about 20 years of declining pair counts of breeding pairs throughout the Atlantic Flyway. And so we're reaching a point that game managers are concerned of this long, steady decline in mallards. During the 2000s. We're already in 2023, so a 20-year decline. During these 20 years, where I live in Connecticut, it's been ex-urban development. We have been ex-urban development for 20 years, 30 years. Most of our development happened in the 60s and 70s. And so I think the wildland-urban interface is a land cover map that describes Connecticut well. This figure that my student put here looks like forest fragmentation. That's not exactly how Connecticut looks. Connecticut, when you fly over Connecticut, you see trees. We are in the top 10 most forested states. But as you're flying over Connecticut, you take any point in space and you drill down, you hit the forest canopy, it's forest, you drill down far more and you hit driveway, urban. So it's forest and urban at the exact same time. That means that's intermixed ecosystem, forest and urban at the exact same time and nearly every point in space in the state of Connecticut. So we live in a place where where wildlife and people live in the same place. So when I started talking to the state biologists about this problem of mallards in decline, there's not evidence that there's changes to adult survival. There's not changes to harvest rates. And so we quickly decided to focus on reproduction. And so hens can use a variety of reproductive strategies. When a hen selects a place to nest, to put her nest, she's really making two behavioral choices. She's choosing where to put the nest, and then she's also choosing where to raise her brood. And so she's making two behavioral choices, and there's demographic consequences associated with each one of those choices. So in my mind, this is like wonderful classic wildlife research. I'm studying habitat selection. It includes a behavioral choice, a demographic consequence. I'm like right in my comfort zone. If we break this down in a little more detail within urbanized landscapes, we can have nesting habitat quality high or low. We can have brood rearing habitat quality high or low. And we can think through this from the perspective of a duck, right? This hen can choose a perfect place to put her nest. But that nest might not be located near good brood rearing habitat. So if the wetland's too deep, has too many large bass in it, or too many snapping turtles, those ducklings aren't going to do so well. So she might have to take her ducklings on a long walk to find a wetland that's small and shallow and has emergent vegetation and invertebrates to eat. Alternatively, she might not care where she puts her nest. She's going to look for brood rearing habitat, that perfect wetland for her ducklings, and just place her nest next to it. That might happen to be in forest because it's not the prairie potholes. We are in a forested landscape. She puts her nest on a forest floor in a place that has increasing coyotes, increasing bobcats, and a wide variety of mesopredators. Alternatively, maybe there's those perfect places on the landscape that are good for both nesting habitat and brood rearing habitat. We'd like to know if those places exist. And we'd assume that that a hen is not going to put her nest in a place that's bad for both. So the questions for this project are really, what reproductive strategies are mallards using in this urbanized landscape? And is the nesting life stage or the brood rearing life stage most affected by this long-term, right, urban development? Will populations persist through time? So our methods are we're using solar GPS backpacks on the hens. This new technology is fabulous. I did my graduate work radio tracking amphibians, and then we went through a decade where transmitters didn't change. Now that we have solar transmitters, it's opening up a whole new world again, and that's very exciting. So we use transmitters. We can now put a transmitter on a hen, we can find her nest, and we can use that to find the ducklings. We actually put out a lot of transmitters the winter before. So when the mallards are congregated at overwintering sites, we deployed 55 solar transmitters. We lost 8 of those to hunter harvest. So we do have hunting pressure. It's not a huge amount of hunting pressure in an urbanized state. And so at the start of the breeding season, we had 47 transmitted hens. 28% of them migrated more than 50 kilometers from Connecticut. And so we are not going to talk about these hens today. 72% of the hens did not migrate, or they stayed within 50 kilometers of where the transmitters were attached. And so we're focusing on these individuals, our resident mallard population. And so we have these fabulous GPS points from our transmitted hens. And with GPS data, you also get accelerometer data. So we're all super fascinated with this new type of data that can provide us information about animal behavior. And so what we see is that the X and Y coordinates of the accelerometer data clearly separate pretty readily when the hen is incubating. This makes sense because mallard hens sit on their nest and incubate for 22 to 23 hours a day. So if we subset this data and look at what the GPS points look like during this period of time, she's in the, you know where her nest is located in this general area, and she's making a few foraging arrays to this local pond. You can go to this area and then find the nest. It happens to be inside of a courtyard. I also have to point out that nesting attempts were only detected in 43% of our transmitted hens. I welcome you to interpret this however you would like, but it is much lower than I was anticipating. I went into this study thinking that we were going to be able to find the nest of every transmitted hen. That meant we had to do a lot of hard work searching for nests the old school hard way of kayaking, walking through dense vegetation. And then we live in a state with 3.6 million people. So we put out tons of press releases, interviewed by the news, and tried to get people to call us when they found a mallard hen in their yard or in a park. And so we got a whole lot of nests in beautiful, pristine wetlands, on hummocks in nice wetlands. We found nests just on the forest floor. Oh boy, I'm at 5 minutes. So let's keep going. Lots of nests, they nest everywhere. So we did Mayfield survival estimates. First year of pilot data, we got an estimate of 12%. The next year with the 46 nests we found, we got an estimate of 34%. With our transmitted hens, we got an estimate of 22%. It drops when you transmitter a hen because you find the nest earlier in the nesting period. And so therefore your Mayfield estimates go down. We did some work looking at, well, what's FX nest survival? We developed operator models, we ranked those models. Most of those hypotheses were not important. at all. The one thing jumped out, and that was whether or not the nest was located on an island or not on an island. So we had 34 nests not on islands, 31 nests on islands. If the nest was on an island, it had a higher probability of survival. We know this from other places. We confirmed it to the extreme in our landscape. We also found that the building density around a nest improved nest survival. So nest survival was higher, the more urbanized the landscape was around the nest. Moving on to the broods. We searched for broods, found the hens, or, find with the GPS collars, find the hen, count the ducklings, and that was very labor intensive. The GPS data looks like this, where a hen is with ducklings, she's at a pond, and then if she loses her ducklings, 5 days later, she flies 2 kilometers to a different pond, and then she flies to a different pond, and then she flies back to a different pond. And so you can readily tell if she loses her ducklings because she starts moving 1 to 2 kilometers among wetlands, which doesn't happen if she's got ducklings walking behind her. So what did the hens do? Some hens nested near brood rearing sites. So you have a nest, she starts moving around with her brood, and she moves around with her brood, and she raises them at this site for the entire brood rearing period, 60 days. Other hens nest were at the yellow dot in an island on a larger water body. As soon as they hatch, they move, and then they move, and then they move 2.8 kilometers in 30 hours. That's a long walk for those ducklings. Most of the time this occurred in a stream. Here's the one instance where they walked over land for quite a long distance. And then they spent the brood rearing period at the small wetland and along this river. We zoom into that. So the important thing is the survival consequences of being in a given habitat or using one strategy over the other. So this is a key slide. Where each line is a brood, and we have the number of ducklings on the y-axis. So we had anywhere between 7 and 14 ducklings in a brood. The red lines are broods that completely failed, dropped to 0 ducklings. So most broods that failed within the first 10 to 20 days. If a hen still had ducklings around by day 30, so say this line, if a hen still had 4 ducklings at day 30, she probably still had 4 ducklings at day 40, day 50, and day 60. So we had 2 broods that survived with 4 ducklings till day 60, and a couple broods where the hen raised a lot of ducklings. And so when you have, let's walk through this. We had 26 broods that hatched 256 ducklings. Of those 256 ducklings, only 46 made it to day 60. That's a survival rate of 18%. That's rather low, potentially the lowest estimate in the literature. And of those 46 ducklings, 22 ducklings came from courtyard or nests that were located inside courtyards. 2 of those nests were in the same courtyard. So there happens to be this school that has a big courtyard with a pond in it and vegetation within it. 2 different hens put their nest inside this courtyard, and they stayed with their ducklings in this courtyard until the ducklings could fly. Probably got some supplemental feeding from the kids at that school. Another hen nested in the courtyard of Central Connecticut State University. Somebody picked up those ducklings, walked them through the building, released them, and the hen took them to a neighborhood pond. And another hen nested twice in the courtyard of this elementary school and had complete brood failure twice at this school. So all of a sudden, these courtyards turned into rather important features of our urban landscape. But what do we know? We know that strategies for raising ducklings, that the mallard hens are using 2 different strategies. Some find brood rearing habitats and put their nests next to them. Others find perfect nesting habitats, such as an island, and then they take their ducklings on a long walk rather than go to the closest wetland. So about 2/3 of the broods made some sort of initial movement. They moved from the nesting location to the brood rearing habitat. The mean distance was 1.2 kilometers. The farthest one was the one I showed you, the 2.8 kilometers. So both strategies were found, both strategies were viable. We had 10 that used the first strategy, 4 were successful, 6 failed. We had 15 that used the second strategy, 8 were successful and 7 failed. What else do I want to say? We're at the Urban Wildlife Conference. 3 of our 26 broods had ducklings at urban sites that really didn't have broodery and wetlands at them. This first one was super cool. The hen nested on an island in a waterfall. So this is a river with a waterfall. She found a little island that was solid poison ivy, an island like the size of this spot, tiny island, solid poison ivy, put her nest there. Nothing depredated it. And then storm happened, piece of wood gets stuck, 2x4. She walked her ducklings along that 2x4 and made it down to the river and raised her brood there. So super cool example. This is the one I talked about in a courtyard that walked to the closest neighborhood pond, and really only one brood that follows the childhood, the Make Way for Ducklings book, where the hen nested in a backyard, walked through an urban landscape, and raised her young in a river. It really didn't have good broodery wetlands. So what have we learned? Nest survival is okay. It's within the range within the literature, but hens are seeking out islands. That island could be a piece of vegetation in the middle of 2 highways that's surrounded by pavement. That counted as an island, in addition to islands in water bodies. Brood survival is low, so low that we looked at individual ducklings, and 48% of the ducklings that made it came from nests in courtyards. And my last point is that it takes a village to raise young. These mallards come in contact to a lot of people. I live in a state with 3.6 million people. That's 275 people per kilometer squared. I work with people all the time. We get up, we find a GPS point, we look where that is, we pick up the phone, we call the landowner and be like, hey, we're coming to your property today. The list of people who help out on projects is enormous for every project that I do. But a big shout out to the field technicians who give their blood and sweat to finding nests and broods. I owe them a lot, and I'll take a question if there is time.
Got time for a couple quick ones.
All the way in the back. I mean, our nests were really scattered throughout the whole state there. And I don't think we necessarily searched or have a strong, they do nest in saltwater wetlands along the coast. I think we only had 1 or 2 nests in our sample that were in that. So I don't think I have the data to really give how they're responding to the coast. I think you had your hand up right away.
So only 40% of your hens that you attach GPS backpacks to nest. Do you have any explanation for that? Or I'm also thinking, is there anywhere in the literature where we know 100% that we should expect most or all of them?
This is where me not being a waterfowl biologist makes it a lot easier to stand up and say, I was rather shocked that this is a not spoken about thing. That's my take. I was expecting more than that.
Okay, thank you very much.
She's gonna, where's the mouse? She said just to close it.
I can't.
Okay. Mousy mouse.
Okay, on with the next presentation by Lois Bowen, who is me. And I'm going to talk about artificial nest site occupancy and reuse of urban burrowing owls in El Paso. So I'll just give you an overview of what's going on with artificial nest site use and reuse in El Paso and the challenges that have faced and solutions to resolve the issues that have management implications. So just briefly, the western burrowing owl is a terrestrial ground dwelling owl, a small migratory raptor, although in our area, some of them are full-time residents. And overall, their populations are declining. They're endangered in Canada, have federal protection in Mexico. They're a species of greatest conservation need in Texas and in many other states. So this is a ground dwelling owl. So they inhabit areas that are open with very low vegetation so they can see around and make sure there are no predators that are available to hurt them or they're young. And they're found in a lot of variety of habitats, but they're generally arid and semi-arid regions like deserts and grasslands and pastures. In our area, western burrowing owls do not dig their own burrows, so they inhabit burrows of other fossorial mammals. And in our region, it's mainly ground squirrels, in particularly the rock squirrel. In other areas, a lot of these owls occupy burrows dug by badgers. So why do we want to provide artificial nest sites for burrowing owls? Well, the owls in our area are already there. They're already inhabiting urban areas in El Paso. And artificial nest sites can be used to mitigate construction impacts and habitat loss. And it also provides opportunities for research on burrowing owl ecology. And also a few studies have documented artificial nest use and reuse within urban city parks in West Texas. So burrowing owls in the El Paso area are extremely adaptable to the human presence and to urban ecosystems. However, this can cause problems for the owls because you find them nesting under sidewalks, in parking lots, in schoolyards, ball fields, golf courses, and just about any kind of drainage or irrigation pipe that you can find, you may find a burrowing owl. So, I mean, this is quite dangerous for them. And a lot of times, especially when it rains in all monsoon seasons, if they're in a drainage pipe, well, the eggs are all going to wash out and in parking lots are going to get hit by cars and so on and so forth. So just a little bit of background about how I became involved in all of this. We initiated a study in 2013 on a 372-acre city park, but it was a natural area park. So it wasn't exactly urban. And our objectives then was to design the best artificial nest site that we could for the success of the burrowing owls and to monitor them for, reproduction, prey behavior, and also determine site fidelity. So between 2013 and 2022, we had 226 artificial nest site events at 15 different sites with 36 fledgling events. So this was a pretty successful endeavor. So that left room for considering perhaps putting these in other areas. But just to let you know what we used, over those years, I experimented with different materials and different sizes of nest boxes, burrows, and entrances. And what I came up as I think is the best design was using the 1/2 gallon of a 30-gallon barrel and a 5-gallon bucket with a non-perforated flexible drainage pipe. Just some pictures of installing artificial nest sites at that natural area. And so now the question is, how are they using these other parks throughout El Paso that are much smaller and much more urban? And we needed this information, to help us with further our burrowing owl conservation efforts. So there's 2 large parks that I monitor. One is the Rio Bosque Wetlands Park, which I'm not going to talk about today. And the other is a large county park, which is a very urban park right in the middle of the city. There are also 6 other urban sites that range from 4.6 to 55 acres that are deep in the urban area. So these nest sites were either constructed artificial nest sites that I actually constructed and installed, or the burrowing owls were using anthropogenic materials that were already found on the site. The number of these artificial nest sites per park was very variable and ranged between 1 to 8 per park. And I monitored them at city, county, and a national park for occupancy, reproduction, and site reuse since 2019. This is just a list of some of the parks, the urban city parks and one national park. And I have a couple of private homeowners associations that are not included in this study. So how did this all come to be? Is that I'm the burrowing owl lady in El Paso and the owl lady, and I get all these calls, and I get calls from city parks, I get calls from city streets, I get calls from engineers and construction companies. There are burrowing owls in a pipe that we have to move. We're putting in a new detention pond. Can you come move these owls? And I very kindly tell them no, because passive relocation of burrowing owls does not work. I have tried it before and it fails every time. So I gave them an option. I said, well, I can, put an artificial nest site in nearby the area and they'll probably move right in. You can move your pipes and everything will be fine. So that's how it started. So I'm going to give you some examples of these sites. This is a non-constructed artificial nest site because the burrowing owls at this county park decided that this discarded old pitcher mound was a wonderful place to put a nest. So they are actually nesting in this pitcher mound, and they have been for years now. And it's been very successful. Although I do have a pointer, but I don't know how to use it. Let me see if this is it. No, it's not. Okay. Well, anyway, above the chain link fence where the cones are is a road, and it's high traffic, hikers, walkers, bicycles, and even cars. And people were coming down into that area. You can see the stairs and getting way too close to those owls, taking pictures. And I was really worried they were gonna, abandon. So I asked them if they could put a protective fence around the area, which they did. They're very cooperative. And so that year we got 4 fledglings. Then I decided that the fencing wasn't enough. They were still coming down and getting too close. So I started putting up signs. One of them was just they're all bilingual. And one is just saying, this is a nesting site, do not disturb. And then later on, I got a little bit more aggressive with the signs, and I put one up that gives the laws, the federal laws and the state laws, protection and ramifications for violating those laws. Just more pictures of that site. Within that pitcher mound, you can see the fledglings. Very successful. This is this year's. The last count I had was 4 owlets, so I don't have a fledgling count yet at that site. There's another example at that same park. These owls found a very large drainage pipe and decided that that was a great place to nest. And so they've been nesting there for years, very successfully. And another example is along this Playa del Paseo del Norte trail, which was designed for walkers and bikers for recreation. And some burrowing owls were nesting in culverts there, as you can see. And they do still every year, and they're successful. And I got requested to put some artificial habitats there along that Playa drain. They wanted more owls for the public to enjoy. So this was one case where it wasn't, the owls were in trouble. So I did. And I put up 2 artificial habitat sites there. And these have also been successful. And I have lots of signs up, and the public doesn't disturb these owls. So I was really happy about that. Everybody gets to enjoy them and gets educational information about the owls. Okay, so this is another example of a rather small city park, and this is the same situation. Got another call. This owl that you see in that picture was living in that rusty old drainage pipe, and they wanted to build a new detention pond there, so they wanted me to move it. I gave him my spiel, and they agreed to let me put an artificial habitat there. So it even helped me build a soil mound up, and I put an artificial habitat in there, and that owl moved in the next day. So they're really tend to, you know, if you provide a home for them, they will move in. If you build it, they will come. Okay, so some of the problems is this was right across the street from a school, and the neighbors were harassing the owls. And so again, I asked for some protection for the owls, and again, the city complied. This time, the street department helped me, and we put our signs up and got those owls protected. Another example, same situation, come move these owls, put an artificial habitat in. This was a pair, they moved in the next day. But this side had some special problems because one year I just found a dead owlet and 2 dead adults. I was called about the dead adults that were dead owls lying around, and I took them to the zoo. The veterinarian there is very cooperative with our raptor program there. And somebody had shot these owls with BB gun. That was not good. So for a couple of years, those owls didn't, there was no nesting at that site. And finally, again, this year we've got nesting owls. I think my last example is just another park. Where I was this one again, I was requested to put an artificial habitat up. And they've been very successful each year. I only had one problem here. Somebody went over them with some kind of ATV vehicle and totally smashed in the top bucket. But fortunately, it was easy for me to repair that. So no great harm done. Oh, one more example. This is the national park where I put some habitat, one habitat in with lots of help. And again, they've been successful. This year we have 7 owlets there. I don't know if you can see them in that picture. Little guys on the bottom. Okay, so I just put this table up to show you the name of the park, how many acres the park is, whether it's urban or rural, and the number of nest sites used at that site and the number of fledglings. So the number of nesting years, nest sites, and fledglings per park was very variable. 5 parks had burrowing owls nesting all 5 years, and the number of fledglings per year in the parks with only 1 habitat ranged from 2 to 8. And the mean number of nest sites used at the large park, the natural park, was 6, while the mean number of fledglings there was 12 for all 6 sites. And this is looking at the reuse, and basically the number of years the nest sites were used ranged from 2 to 5 years, and the percentage of nest site reuse ranged from 50 to 90%. You can see the column on the right is the natural area site within the city limits, where the percentage of reuse is a little bit lower than it is in the smaller city parks. And the natural area has an abundance of predators, where the city parks are pretty low in predators. So that made a difference. And again, the number of years are variable. The percentage of nest reuse was 50 to 90. But the results indicate that artificial burrows provide long-term nest sites for burrowing owls. And this has important implications for management and future conservation of this species. Just a few things to consider is there a prey base at the park? Arthropods is their main diet, followed by rodents. They also eat reptiles and a low percentage of songbirds. And also to consider what kind of predators are in the park. All these photos were taken at that natural area park where I have tons of predators. So what you need to do if you're going to be doing this is you have to work with the city or the county or whoever is owner of the site on protecting the sites with buffers or barriers, educational signs and kiosks, widespread education and habitat management programs. So I'm going to go through this really quick. if you can get the staff there to help you provide these things, that's very helpful because a lot of us are really limited on our budgets. So I designed the signs and then I looked for somebody else to sponsor producing them. And I've been very lucky. The zoo has sponsored all my nesting signs, the smaller one up here. And City Streets have done the legal signs here for me. So I always try to get partners. Artificial nest sites do not work if there are not birding owls already present in the area. They must be present somewhere in the area or they're not going to find it. And keep them away from schools and roads, and be very patient with government agencies, especially the federal government, where it took forever to get it going. Really important to make connections with the staff at these sites so they will help you. And to inform them and the public on the breeding season and to get help, to have someone that's going to be willing to do the management, which means you've got to keep the vegetation low in the area. You've got to check the burrows in the nest box for filling in of soil. And so I have a variety of methods that I use for this, including old laundry brushes and fish tape and leaf blowers. Of course, you have to make sure the owls are gone. And I don't know how I did on time since I'm the monitor. Okay, I do have time for questions. Yay. Yes.
I'm a little curious about the chain link fence and that people don't like or dislike the chain link fence. Do people say anything about liking or disliking it when you put a chain link fence up around the sites to protect
No.
the?
No, I haven't had a single complaint. Yeah, I mean, they can, you can still get pictures. But the owls, the owlets are totally protected. And when they're fledged, they just fly out of them.
Right, I was just wondering if people would be interested in prettier fences. I mean, the fences really to keep people back. There's other ways to create barriers that keep people back.
Well, we did discuss that, but we thought that was the best and the easiest way to do it.
And chain link fence is cheaper.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you. We have a few more minutes and then we will get to our last session before coffee break.
I mean, even now, you'll find trees small. It's weird.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right, our next session is Benjamin Ewing, and he's going to talk about changes in avian mobbing responses, sorry, need my glasses, along an urban rural gradient in Southern California.
All right, thank you. So yes, I will be talking about, changes in mobbing responses along an urban trail gradient. This was my thesis project at California State University, Long Beach. So I think everyone here is well aware of the fact that the rate of urbanization around the world is rapidly increasing. And with that increase in urbanization comes an increase in changes in biodiversity, as well as changes in animal behavior in these urban environments. So one of the best ways to study changes in urban areas, as many of you are familiar, is to create an urban to rural gradient and examine how behaviors or some other factor changes along the gradient. So again, just for those who are less familiar, you start with the dense urban area where there's high impervious cover, low amount of trees. As you move into the suburbs, you get a little bit larger yards, a little bit more green, but still a bit of structure. And then on the other end, you have the rural areas with low human development. So many changes have been documented over the years along urban to rural gradients, including changes in the community composition, changes in species interactions along the gradient, as well as changes in anti-predator behavior. So one type of anti-predator behavior that has not been studied very much in urban areas is mobbing in birds. So mobbing is defined as a demonstration which is directed at a potential predator. It's initiated by a potential prey species. Very common behavior in birds, common response in multiple taxa, in fact, widely studied in a variety of contexts. Some of the things we know about it, in birds, it's been shown to lead to reduced levels of predation and increased breeding success. So this is a key anti-predator behavior. Some studies have shown that mobbing is a learned behavior. So this is something that birds observe, they learn by observing others engaging in it. It's influenced by predator presence. So some studies have found that when the predator in question that's being mobbed is locally abundant, you get a stronger mobbing response than if it's rare. It's also influenced by the density of the vegetation right at the site where the mobbing is occurring. Studies have shown that where you have a lot of dense vegetation, you have stronger mobbing responses, likely because the vegetation provides cover if the predator turns and attacks. So all of these things I've just listed are things that potentially could be influenced by urbanization, which makes it worth investigating how this affects mobbing. One last topic that's relevant to mobbing before we go on to the study is the idea of eavesdropping. So some species will listen in or eavesdrop on the vocalizations of other species, and they can hear the alarm calls of others, which contain information about the predator, and then they can make an appropriate response, maybe to flee, maybe to freeze, or perhaps to actually start mobbing. This is also can be a learned behavior. Studies have demonstrated this, at least in some systems. And for fairly obvious reasons, eavesdropping can potentially be disrupted by anthropogenic noise. So we have the idea of acoustic masking, which is basically that if there's a lot of noise, the birds simply can't hear the calls of others and therefore fail to respond. So obviously urban areas, we have changes in noise levels, so this could influence these responses. So this brings me to the questions I was asking. Again, how does urbanization affect avian mobbing? And in order to do that, I proposed a series of hypotheses looking at some of these different factors that I've just gone over. So there's a few of them, which I'll run through quickly. So the first we're looking at is, the first hypothesis is that mobbing responses will change along the gradient due to predator presence, due to the fact that mobbing is learned. And if this is supported, we would expect that we'll see mobbing responses only in areas where the predator in question occurs. A second is that the changes in mobbing responses will be driven by larger scale vegetation changes in the urban landscape. And if this is the case, we expect there to be changes in mobbing responses along with the percent impervious surfaces in the area. Our other vegetation-related hypothesis is that the changes in mobbing responses will change due to the immediate vegetation structure right around the point. And again, if that's the case, we would expect to see changes relative to the local vegetation structure. The fourth hypothesis is that changes will be in mobbing will be driven by community turnover, specifically avian community turnover, and this gets to the eavesdropping and mobbing network hypothesis. So if certain, if there's change in species, that could disrupt those networks. So if this is supported, we'd expect that the changes related to species composition. And then lastly, noise is the other factor. So we might see changes with related to noise. In this case, we'd probably expect there to be less mobbing as average noise increases. So that's a lot of different things that we're looking at in order to figure out how these different aspects of urbanization are impacting mobbing. We did a series of experiments. So I was working in Southern California. These are some of the native habitats that you'd see here. We've got chaparral, coastal sage scrub, riparian woodlands. This is what it would look like in the more rural sites. The focal species we're looking at is the community of small passer and songbirds. So here's just an example of some of the ones we might be seeing: bush tit, wren tit, couple towhees, hermit thrush, Turkey junco. There's a lot more, but these are some of the most frequent responders. We have the urban to rural gradient, so we have our urban points, heavily urbanized. We have intermediate points, sort of semi-urban green spaces surrounded by a bit of development. And then rural points, which are rural. Here's a map of our study sites. So we had two primary transects. One is located in Pasadena in Los Angeles County. The other is in Anaheim and Orange County. And then we had a couple other isolated sets of points to provide different treatments. So we have sort of two broad categories. We have sites where the predator in question, which I'll get to in a moment, is present, and then sites where the predator is absent. And then we can sort of broadly think of three levels of urbanization: urban, semi, and rural. So we have urban sites with the predator, urban without, semi with, semi without, and so on. We were unfortunately not able to get any rural sites with no predator, but we have all these other treatments which will allow us to make some of these comparisons. So a methodology, we did a playback of the calls of the western screech owl. This is a common predator of small birds whose calls are known to elicit mobbing responses in small passerines. As a control, we use the mourning dove. It's a common harmless species that is similar in size to the screech owl. So we did the playback, and the playback was accompanied by a stuffed museum specimen. So we had both an audio and visual component in our study. So in order to quantify the species that are found at each location, we did point counts. So all birds seen or heard within 100 meters of the point were recorded. We did a 10-minute point count. Following the 10-minute point count, we immediately played a 3-minute recording of either the call of the western screech owl or the mourning dove. And again, we had the speaker with the model, so we had both of those components. And then after the playback continued, we continued to monitor for another 5 minutes. Any mobbing behaviors that we observed were recorded, so we were able to quantify whether or not a mobbing response occurred. So we had a total of 40 points, 2 primary gradients, then, like I said, a couple other points to sort of fill out that our study design. Each point got 1 predator and control per round. We had 2 rounds in the spring, 2 in the winter, so we had a seasonal component. So this came out to 320 total playback trials, half of which were control, half of which were owl. So we got all that data. Then following the field season, we collected vegetation data at each of the points to sort of quantify the vegetation right around the site where we were doing the playback. We also calculated percent impervious cover to quantify urbanization. In order to analyze community turnover, we had to determine which species were found at each site relative to the others. To do this, we calculated Bray-Curtis dissimilarity. So for those who aren't familiar with this, it's a scale. It ranges from 0 to 1, in which 0 means both sites have the same species composition. 1 means they're completely different. And this allows us to just tell how the community is changing. So to analyze this, we use general linearized mixed models, model selection with AIC. We use likelihood ratio tests to determine significance. Our response variables were the number of species that mobbed at each point, and then the number of individuals that mobbed. We found there was no relationship between the number of individuals or species found at a point and percent impervious cover. So basically the number of species detected was consistent across the gradient. So we used numbers instead of proportions in this case. So we had 5 sets of models. So for our first model, we were looking at predator presence. So that was our variable, was whether or not the screech owl was found there. For the second set, we're looking at impervious cover. The third was vegetation. So we had a couple different vegetation variables that we measured. And so we had several models here, did model selection to find the best one, which turned out to be just percent woody ground cover. So the percentage of the ground within 20 meters of the point that was covered by woody vegetation. Gray-Curtis community scores was for the fourth. And then for the final one, we had average noise. All models contained playback, whether it was a control or an owl, and then point was the random effect in all models. So getting to the results. So for our first hypothesis, predator presence, you can see here on the left, for the cases where the screech owl was present, we had a higher number of mobbing individuals than in sites where it was absent. These are the model predictions for our top models. We saw the same pattern for the number of species. However, this was not significant, statistically significant according to our model. For our second, impervious cover, so this is sort of large scale urbanization. For both the number of mobbing individuals and species, we found that there was a decrease in mobbing as impervious cover increases. So the more urbanized it got, decreases in mobbing. Both of these were significant. For the local vegetation, so for percent woody ground cover at the point, for both individuals and species, as woody cover increased, we saw an increase in the number of both mobbing individuals and species. And you can see that from the model predictions here. We did not find a significant relationship between mobbing individuals or species when it comes to community turnover. You can see on the predictions here, there's a slight pattern there. You can kind of maybe see something going on, but neither of these were statistically significant. So it doesn't look like overall community turnover is what's driving these responses. And lastly, for noise, we have a very obvious pattern here. This was significant for both. As noise increases at the point, the number of mobbing individuals decreases, and the same for the number of mobbing species. So to summarize this, for individuals, the number of individuals who mob, we saw decreasing mobbing as background noise increased, increase in mobbing with increasing vegetation density, decrease in mobbing with increasing impervious cover, and then increase in mobbing where the predator is present, which gives strong indication that this is in fact a learned behavior, which is consistent with all the other literature on this topic. Patterns were basically the same for species. Again, as noise increases, mobbing decreases. Mobbing is more mobbing with denser vegetation, and then a decrease in mobbing with increasing impervious cover. Coming back to community turnover, which was the only one of our hypotheses that we did not find any support for, doesn't appear to influence mobbing, at least not the way we mentioned it. However, it's worth mentioning that we found that overall community turnover does not influence. However, it's very possible that there's one or two species that sort of serve as the keystone informants in the eavesdropping networks, the alarm calling networks, and these species give the alarms or initiate the mobbing response. And if one of these species were to drop out in the urban areas, it's still possible that you could have some sort of community turnover driven change in mobbing that just wasn't picked up the way that we measured it here. So a few future directions this could be taken. One would be to test this with a different predator. So we used a nocturnal predator that's predominantly located audibly. If you were to use, say, a diurnal predator that's visually detected, like a Cooper's hawk, it's possible you'd see a different pattern. Although for a variety of reasons, I would expect we'd still see the same thing. Most of the factors that we saw here as significant probably would affect any sort of mobbing. Trials in other regions could be interesting. What we found in Southern California, different areas, it's possible that the pattern, and each city is very different in terms of the landscape, and so you might see different things in different places. And then lastly, we want to evaluate the role of the keystone informants in mobbing. So is there one or two species here in this community that's driving mobbing responses, whose absence in an urban area could lead to a breakdown in the information network and changes therefore in the mobbing response? So one of my colleagues at Long Beach is working on this right now. So I want to thank everyone, my thesis advisor, Ari Martinez, everyone else who contributed to my project at Long Beach. And yeah, with that, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, Eric.
I think I maybe missed this, but did you go out when you're doing the mobbing stuff? Presumably that's the evening time when the owls be calling, so that's when mobbing would be highest. Were you going for day at all when you were doing your time?
Yes, yeah, I did not mention that, but yeah, we always did it 2 hours prior to sunrise or 2 hours, it was 2 hours post sunrise, 2 hours prior to sunset. So these are peak activity, songbird activity, as well as the times when an owl would be most likely to call. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yes.
I feel like I noticed mobbing behavior most often in corvids and mockingbirds.
Mhm.
Do you have any curiosity about those species or extending the study to those mobbing species?
Yes, that would definitely be another potentially interesting thing to look at. One thing about birds is they tend to only mob the species that are their direct predators. So a screech owl is pretty small. It's it's like this big. It's similar-ish in size to a burrowing owl. So mockingbirds and crows basically ignore them. But if hawks, red-tailed hawks, great horned owls, those will definitely get attention from the larger species. And so it would be interesting to see how those type of responses change in urban areas, because it might be a different pattern than what we're seeing in the small songbird community. Yes.
Just more of a comment. So in the East, the mobbing flocks are typically led by chickadees and titmice or the parrot-based species.
Mhm.
Do you think in your system is Southern California, the teat be leading the mobbing?
Potentially, yeah. We have titmice in a lot of these habitats, and we were surprised to to see that they really were not seeming to play any role in what I saw here. But yeah, the wren tit, the bush tit, the towhee, those are sort of the species that we're kind of thinking potentially might be some of the ones driving it. It's not as obvious as it is in some of the other systems as to who exactly is like leading the flocks and stuff. You don't have flocking in quite the same way as there is in some more in the East. But that's what we're looking at right now, is trying to figure out who exactly that is. And yeah, some of those are the ones we're kind of zeroing in on. Yes.
Not sure if I missed it, but which screech owl calls do you broadcast a variety of their calls? One call do you stuck with?
It was we had a series of, it was like the sort of the typical song of the Western screech owl. We had multiple replicates of it. But yeah, it was like the typical, they make obviously a lot of vocalization. So it was the typical song, which we found in other, in before we started the project, just from going out and playing it back, got pretty strong responses from these birds. All right.
Thank you, everybody. The 3:30 session has been canceled, so we will resume the session at 3:50, and there'll still 3 presentations left. 3:50.
I live in Forest Left.
I have a random question for you.
Me?
You,
Me?
I need to get a picture of you presenting. I forgot to do that. My university wants it. If I just popped it up and stood here for a second, a moment, could you get a picture?
I could, if you help me read this.
What do you need?
Well, I asked Jessica if I could have a copy of her egret presentation.
Uh-huh.
Do you see it?
That was the.
Oh, morning. Let me just get that and then you can, I'll take as many pictures of you. You'll. Okay, do you see an egret one?
Yeah.
That's a rookery.
Which one?
Hers was rookeries,
Okay,
right?
that's it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, now, this must be my flash drive, I'm assuming. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't show it that it moved it. Geez, how do you expect anybody to read that stuff? Yeah, there it is. Okay, now let's go back to you. Were you morning or after? You were afternoon, right?
Yep.
Okay, let's go back there. Man, I gotta get my glasses.
I can do it too.
Can you do?
Yeah.
Can you? Like, give me a break. Not everybody here is 20 years old.
All right. It looks like IUW, this is the conference, right?
These are,
Go, we use that back arrow right there. Back again.
there we
All
go.
right, there it is. It's right
Over
there,
there.
deep open. This one.
Here?
One more up.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
it.
Okay, you pick your slide. Which one do you want it on?
I can load it up. It's fine.
I can't think off the top of my head, I'm starting to focus on that specifically, or the probably was song. I think my guess is that that's what it is.
All right, so
Question.
whatever looks best. So I'm here today to talk about golden shoot stars. What we found was to get some. They come out okay. So I don't usually get that request, but my boss said I need a picture, so
I
okay.
had you take one of me. Would
Well,
you
we could do
that
that
for me?
now. Yeah.
Would you? Okay,
Is that the new, that's not the new name.
I mean, because I'm wearing my owl shirt and my burning out earrings.
Yes.
Well, now you're gonna have to help me find mine. Is this it?
I'm not.
Oh, darn. Can't believe anybody can. Here I am. I don't know what picture though. How about this one? Okay, this is a cool picture.
All right.
Now my phone.
Camera.
That's a great one.
All right, so.
Was the university.
Good.
So Laura's.
It's hard to
I know,
pretend, you
isn't it?
know, it's like,
Take a look. They look okay. Take another one.
I just want to make sure my eyes are open. It's not cooperating. I don't know, I couldn't see anything. Yeah, my eyes are open. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, awesome.
All righty. So now we're on break.
You sort of think about, and I was like, this is like, I was like, sure. Yeah, I think I saw. Finishing it off. I know everybody's, I got a bunch of rest. I'm excited about this one too. It's part of this big project.
Have you picked if you were to do that, like what species?
Yeah.
What have you-
So
It's gonna change next time. Study. Send the PDFs to you. Absolutely. Yeah, so do that. When the players, who's ever been to that? He was out as soon as they must have gone. It was definitely not a cool piece of stuff. Or it's like, doing all this stuff. So you don't see on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, did you? No, I'm in here. I don't know, yeah. Oh, you did, but. Check this out, I'm wearing, well, I came down. I can see. Yes, so yeah, I don't even know how they spent my bag, that landscape college, which was earlier in the spring. It was in my toes now. I don't even know how I got in there. I think this is it. Yeah. So I'm just gonna talk about like.
I think the.
I have 6. So we're starting to be published at my university. Pause. Just kind of look that up.
Excited, I asked this because I was with Shinty that they're. So I-
It really is an exciting time. So I started thinking. We're trying to get super focused within LA.
I'm slated to teach wildlife management. This, which I should have been actually. I've never thought to. But I think I have no one. But that's because I.
Yeah.
I'm excited. So soon, graduating people, and I have very little on the pipeline, so. So.
Yeah, it was Google stalking you a while ago.
Well,
I noticed that shift. Over there. You know.
I lost her, so. And then, Laura defended.
Yeah, positive transition then.
And then. She comes, but she's not. Like this. And then she's coming, she's currently living in Korea. So it's a big move for her. So she's like, I can't. Yeah. I need the time. So it's a little across. So I'm excited.
I don't know, like.
I think she's.
It is for a while, I was thinking inside the preserve.
And with all of.
Yeah.
Most
School
people
district.
use around, their own.
Yes.
I'm anticipating it being canceled.
So that's the and stuff.
Yeah, I think what I'll do most likely is push it back and teach it.
Yeah.
Well, I do have to run.
Although that screws up my whole rotation.
Yeah, I saw you, and I was hoping to shake your hand, so
Yes.
it's good meeting you there, and then I'll see you at the next one.
Yes, we did.
In the spring,
I won't, I would love to be, but I can't. Can't afford so many conferences.
I know, yeah, I'm.
So I've been working
doing
with
it
some
really
of my
hard.
RT offices.
I need to, I haven't been there for the last.
Yeah.
Start spreading the word.
COVID hit and virtual.
It's gonna be intense. Very fun.
It'd be fun, I mean, I wish I was going.
So I've been
Yeah.
doing some collaborations.
I want to.
He's super excited about that.
It's gonna be, you know, and see, I
Good to meet you as well.
Just spread the textbooks and it's in my office all the time. I do that. He's a friend of me asking Dally's questions about the textbook. Yeah, I mean, he will die if you do. I hadn't even thought that one. Anyways, Tom is gonna teach. Well, no, because UConn doesn't let faculty co-teach, because it's a waste of money to have two professors in a row, but I fully intend to be there. Yeah. Unofficially assisting with the class. Because I think it's gonna be super awesome. So, spread the word in EB. Yeah, that makes me want to work on. That we're gonna, be doing that spring semester. I need to make sure I advertise as well, because hopefully I have another student on by spring. Are you taking those masters? It's always driven by money, since we don't have the TA opportunities that you guys have. Really? No. I only get one TA every other year. Oh my God. So I only bring on students on board. So that's our department functions very. Yeah. So that's why we have fewer students and we. So it's all driven by the money. So we'll see. Since I'm down to, you know, I want to take on another student from fall just because or by spring, just because I'm not so few students. Motivation to write grants is difficult. But I think, we'll see. I'll like this.
I know everybody's been having problems advancing, so I just want to make sure. Yeah. Oh, you're gonna put your son to it, yeah. This is kind of weird though, like I don't even know how to close the thing.
But you can build your presentation or hide your graphics, you know what I mean, the little text. The captions. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I don't know that function.
Well, I mean, like, just warn people that there will be a box of closed captioning, so we need a space where you can put it where it won't cover up your graphs and stuff. Because I feel like you can build your presentation around that.
Well, I think it's all changed in PowerPoint, the most recent update.
Well, I mean, like, you could just build your PowerPoint and just make sure you leave a space where you can scoop the box. You know what I mean? Oh, are you saying that like sometimes it's this shape and sometimes it's that shape? I don't know.
I mean, right, I mean, I just struggle because I am just pulling slides from the students.
Oh, cool, you were on, Chris.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't make any of these slides, it was me modifying slides.
Yeah.
I recently gave a talk where I was pulling slides from 3 different students.
Oh,
my
that must be fun. Little Frankenstein presentation.
You gotta do the whole big lab overview project.
The lab turned it, well, the PowerPoint file turned into this here. I don't know, I mean, that was. It's like, this is
I don't think I can
ridiculous
handle
file size. So one is clearly one of my students did not have an insert photo thing, they must have just. copied
And it was just like little question marks or whatever. That's always fun.
The details of. Well, I'll use Google Slides, so that's even worse.
Oh my gosh, that drives me nuts. I'm just like, everybody PowerPoint, like, I've not allowed it. You must use PowerPoint. They still show slides. It's just how everybody does it now. From like elementary school on.
Yeah.
That's all they do.
We use everything in OneDrive, just because that's how the university does it, and then it like doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's not-
My students are seniors and they still don't understand that they can download
Yeah.
the software onto their computers and they'll be like, what can I analyze data in Excel? And I'm like, it's because you haven't downloaded it to your computer, which I told you to do as a freshman. They don't. Kids these
Soon we're gonna
days.
have implants, it's gonna have Bluetooth, like it's gonna be
upload into our brain, Bluetooth to the computer. We'll have to do
Well, the
anything.
Google Microsoft.
We talk. Yeah. Last talks of the day.
I
in the
know,
whole
you're
conference. Well, all of us, like. Just like. I'm looking for a walk or something. Yeah.
First, research. There's somewhat difficult to read.
Is there any one for you?
Oh, really? You've been in here all.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I wanted to see. I mean, that number, but I wanted to see Tracy's spare person.
Yeah, it was cool. It's like food shit, wild line, you know, like kayaking, raiders, devices.
Yeah, like the. All the Maui breeding were in these little courtyards or whatever.
Yeah. That's pretty. She's saying.
I'm sure, right, they're, she's saying that they're commodity. It's hard to just imagine them, right, I feel like it just. And that's not, is that true in
I feel like every single one is
California?
it's just. You know, yeah, again, obviously, right,
I mean,
there.
like to me, but.
You can find it.
Yeah, it's nice going that way.
Mhm.
Ray, which was this. That's new, but I don't know, it's some. Maybe, I don't know. And yeah, Michelle was saying, so it's Ray that, you know, it's coming down from Canada, I guess.
Wow.
But actually, I guess I can see on my phone, so notice that for.
At New York, we're just.
Oh, was it?
The world, yesterday.
Oh, really?
We're pretty bad up here today. Definitely.
Really?
It says only one to smoke 6 packs of cigarettes, then you're off like 20 minutes.
Oh, cow, really?
Yeah.
Goodness, okay. I mean, I think you might have-
Are you a tech person for the
Yeah,
next
I'm
session?
back.
Good.
So I'm trying to not miss it.
So Cat keeps in. Here's the next.
Yeah, I think it's right here.
Are you looking for?
I was just gonna try and move it into the folder.
Yeah, mine's the wood talk. There.
Is it at the top?
Yeah, that one.
You wrote it, didn't
On
you?
the last.
Okay. And
And
then,
then mine's somewhere on the desktop.
is it there? Okay, I just wanted. Cool. Maybe move things so it's easier to see. Oh, it's gonna leave it open. You're going right now. aren't you?
Yeah.
Minimize.
This one is.
Yeah. Well. we're-
He's there.
I'll be introducing you.
Yeah, sorry.
And so I'll give you timing for 15 minutes. That leaves you 5 minutes for questions. So
Okay.
if you go over, it's okay. Just as long as you're done before the next speaker.
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
See,
I don't know if they paused it or not.
I didn't, I didn't see it's not paused, so
That's just
share, so here, let's just.
Okay, it is. We're good. Awesome. Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. No worries.
That's so cool.
All right.
Get there again. If you have your hand, I don't know why I'm left-handed, I should be able to do left-handed.
Turn left, turn right, stop.
I went to British Columbia this evening.
Do that too, I'm on the East Coast, just so far, I've been seeing some pictures, 'cause people have been banding.
Okay, thanks for coming back, y'all. And we're going to continue with our sessions. Our next speaker is Ketke Samuel. And the presentation is on tolerance for urban development varies seasonally for Connecticut birds.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, hi, this is my first talk and I'm gonna have to run out back home right after. So I hope no one has too many tough questions for me. But yeah, my name's Ketke Samuel, and today I'm going to be talking about a new framework we came up with to understand how birds respond to human development. And then a way we tested that using different types of land use gradients in Connecticut and different species of birds. So as we all know, as urban ecologists, biologists, and scientists, humans transform environments, and this has trickle-down impacts on many different species. The two primary ways that this human development or this human activity impacts land is through these two processes. There's urbanization, by which natural environments are converted into permanent and dense human settlements. So this is typically what we think of as cities. There's also ruralization, which can happen as a precursor or simultaneously. And this is where natural environments are converted for human use, but without high human population density. So this can be areas like farms, orchards, or pastures. It can also be stuff like highways and airports, anywhere really that there's a lot of human activity, but not high population density.
And we know that these two processes create habitat filters. So they remove a lot of species from sites where there is a lot of human development. So a habitat filter is an abiotic or biotic factor that prevents a species from persisting at a site. And to step back into the theory a little bit, habitat filters are what shape communities. So if we go into community ecology theory, Keddy and Laughlin came up with this great figure in 2021. So we have the regional species pool here on the right, and that represents all the possible species that you might see across all of your sites, represented here by different shapes and colors. And that species pool undergoes filtering. So filtering is this process where species reduce their presence at a site in response to intolerable conditions. So in response to those filters that we believe that urbanization and ruralization create. So this filtering process is typically based on the traits of the species as well as the traits of the environment. And since different habitats have different traits, we see different outcomes at different sites. So a community is a subset of a regional pool that's found at a particular site in a particular time. And you can see that these communities vary, and that's because filtering acted differently upon them. So now how do we measure this concept of filtering? So Keddy and Laughlin came up with the power of the filter, 1 minus the number of species in the assemblage over the number of species in the pool. Basically, this represents the proportion of species that are removed from the regional pool at a single site. So imagine you have a gradient from undeveloped to developed, and you see that at the undeveloped sites, you have 100 species. At the developed sites, you only have 10. You can see that that filtering power occurs very strongly. You have a high power because a lot of species are being lost. And so this is really useful because it gives a single statistic that allows us to describe and compare communities across this kind of gradient. However, it doesn't provide any information on individual species responses. So we don't know which species are being lost, how quickly, and how at what kind of responses are happening, really. So I'm just going to set this up for you with a few graphs. So all you really need are two variables in this framework. You need some gradient of human development. So here that's represented on the x-axis, and it's really simple. It just goes from 0 undeveloped to 1 developed. And then you need some kind of variable about species occurrence. So here, oh no, my points are gone. Okay, well, you can imagine that there would be presences and absences along that gradient, and you might see more presences where the sites are undeveloped, and then as development increases, you get more absences. And we can represent that with a really simple model, and that's a binomial generalized linear model. So that takes that equation over to the right. And so this basically represents how the probability of species presence changes across our gradient. And this is really excellent because this gives us an understanding of how filtering occurs for that species across that gradient. So unlike the power of the filter, we can actually take 3 different statistics for each species to describe this response. We can take the intercept, beta 0, which is the probability of species occurrence when sites are undeveloped. So that gives us kind of a baseline for the occurrence of the species. Then we can take the slope, which tells us the intensity, the magnitude, and the direction of that transition from presence to absence. That's represented by beta 1. And then we can take these two coefficients together, negative beta 0 over beta 1, and we get mu, which is the threshold. And the threshold basically represents where on the x-axis the model crosses 50%. And that gives us an understanding of how much development is necessary to provoke that transition. And so the slope and the threshold are really important because they can help indicate when filtering is actually present. As you can imagine, there are a lot of cases where species respond in ways that don't actually represent filtering. So one of those would be the positive response seen here. And again, my points are gone. I don't know what, there's a point gremlin. But imagine you have a species where it's absent with low development and it's present at areas with high development, something like rock pigeons or raccoons, maybe not raccoons. I don't know enough about mammals to say that. But this would not be filtering because the species isn't being lost from the community. And you can also see cases where the species is just ubiquitous, common across its whole range, across the whole gradient of human development at a probability higher than 50%. So this doesn't constitute filtering because the species isn't responding. And the same thing can happen under 50%, representing a rare species. So with all this in mind, we wanted to answer some biological questions about how species respond to urban development and how filtering really varies between different times of the year and between different gradients. So as far as our data goes, we started with this great data set on bird presence and absence across the state of Connecticut through the Connecticut Breeding Bird Atlas. So we divided the state into 601 survey blocks covering the entire state. And then at each block, a volunteer bird watcher surveyed different sites within the block between 2018 and 2021. So we have a really broad range of data about habitat use by birds at those sites. And these surveys occurred in the summer, which is the breeding season, as well as the winter. So we can see how habitat use changed over different seasons, or how occurrence changed over different seasons. As far as human development goes, we got satellite imagery from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration through a 2016 satellite run, which gave us a whole bunch of different land coverage classes. And so for this analysis, we took the 3 that were based on human activity. So in purple, you have impervious surfaces, which are largely concentrated around Connecticut's waterways. In green, you have developed open space, which is like lawns and grasses, and that's often near the impervious surface. And then in tan, you have farm space, and that's mostly in the northern corners of the state. So you can see there's this kind of patchwork of land use across the state, and that gives us a really good study site for understanding how species respond to different urban variables or human-associated variables. So we created models for 68 species. We chose these 68 species because they're common in both the summer and the winter. So we were able to understand how their use of space around Connecticut might change, or their use of different development types. And we created 6 models for each species. So for each combination of land cover and season, we made a model. And yeah. So here are results for the summer. What we're looking at are the slopes for all of these models on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we see the 3 different gradients in the summer. So on top, we have impervious, then developed, then farmed. And you can see that impervious and developed are pretty similar to each other, but farmed looks a bit lower, but the means are all positive. So that indicates that we probably didn't see filtering for most of these species. And the numbers back this up. So for the impervious filter in the summer, we found no species with filtering, a few that had a positive response, but most actually showed no response. The same pattern holds for the developed filter, and the farm filter showed a few species that show filtering, a lot that actually show positive responses to increasing farmed cover, and then a few that showed no response. The results for the winter are pretty similar. You can see that impervious and developed are pretty similar to each other and positive. However, the mean for farmed filtering, the slopes are now below 0. So that suggests that a lot more species may experience filtering in the winter based on the farmed gradient. And we kind of see that in the data again. No species underwent filtering from impervious or developed cover in the winter, but we saw 11 species that were filtered by farmed cover. But again, most of them had that rare ubiquitous response. Now, looking within filters and across seasons, we see a little bit of a different pattern. So here we see that the slopes for summer are lower than the slopes for winter, which suggests that filtering is stronger in the summer based on impervious surfaces than in the winter. And this makes sense based on some of our hypotheses. You have the urban heat island effect in cities, which makes this areas a lot warmer than their surrounding rural regions. And so that might be attractive to birds during the winter when it's pretty cold. Developed open space showed no seasonal pattern, and that aligns with our hypothesis that that when there's sufficient cover, vegetation year-round in places like lawns and parks, that birds might not be seasonally affected. And finally, when we look at farmed filtering, the slopes are much lower in winter than in summer. And this, again, aligns with our hypothesis. So farmed areas will have food in the summer and they lack food in the winter. So they would be much more of a harsh environment in the winter. And so we expect that species will be filtered out. So to conclude, we found evidence for filtering in relatively few species. We didn't see filtering in any species in relation to the impervious cover or the proportion of developed open space. We did see filtering in 9 species in the summer for farmed area and 11 in the winter. And evidence suggests that there may be differences in seasons between seasons in impervious and farmed gradients. So we still have to run a few statistical tests on these, but we're seeing some evidence for seasonal differences. And with that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about my next steps. So all of this that I've told you about is pretty much the first chapter of my dissertation. But what we'd really like to do is better understand why filtering occurs and what parts of human development lead to filtering. So one of the next steps we're going to take is combining a whole set of urban gradients, including light pollution, noise pollution, road density, human population density, and a variety of other variables to see how filtering varies along these different gradients, whether species respond more similarly to one of the gradients or if they all vary. And then we also want to look at spatial scale. So these relatively weak evidence for filtering is likely due to the spatial scale of this data. So our survey blocks were about 9 kilometers squared. We believe that if we redo these surveys at a finer spatial scale, we'll be able to get a better understanding of what's actually happening for these bird species, especially if we narrow that spatial scale to about the size of their home range. And finally, we'd like to incorporate some trait-based analyses and see whether species with similar traits respond similarly to different filters. And that hopefully will let us predict how filtering will occur for species beyond our data set. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my funders. I was really lucky this year to be funded through the NSF, through the Team Terra Fellowship. And also, we want to thank all the funders for the Connecticut Bird Atlas along the bottom. And like I said, I have to run right after this. So please get in touch with me. There's my email address and my Twitter account. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know. Thank you.
We have a lot of time for questions.
Awesome. Yeah.
I'm just curious about which species it was that were getting filtered, like the 9 and the 11.
Yeah.
Some specifics. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I unfortunately don't have that in my slides, but I believe it was pretty phylogenetically mixed. There wasn't like any clear signal that it was like warblers or ducks, say. It was kind of diverse, but yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember the specifics for that one.
One issue that comes to mind for me, at least, with the filtering stuff and not being able to find it here was the selection of the 68 species who were common in both summer and winter.
Yeah.
Do you think it's maybe just because like these are the successful urban birds for this area, so maybe you've already chosen the ones that have been not filtered, maybe?
Totally. So that's definitely something that we were considering, that we just don't see filtering because we chose birds that are common. So we tried to get around that by choosing species where there were, I think, at least 30 presences and 30 absences to make sure that it wasn't just species that were present across the board that would screw up our models. But yeah, we want to redo these analyses using the full breadth of the 200 something species that the Connecticut Bird Atlas has track of, and especially including migratory species, we believe will get us some interesting results.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. So that's another thing. Obviously, these species are non-migratory because they're present in the summer and the winter. Yeah.
What are some of the traits you're gonna look into?
So traits that we're going to look into, that's chapter 4. So I haven't really figured it all yet. But one that we are really interested in is trophic level, because we expect that I have a coworker who works on urban insects, and we expect that insectivores are going to be pretty hurt in cities or in human developed areas at large. So that's one of our working theories. Yeah. Yeah, that's an awesome question. How will I use this to inform and engage communities? And I think one of the really cool things that I've been able to do in my life is work at a kids museum and talk to kids about animals and birds and how they could relate to ecology in their own lives. And so I think once we have that more definitive list of which species are being filtered and lost, we can then go to the community and say, these are the species that you might see in your neighborhood, but you might not see in 5 or 10 years because of ongoing development. So I think, yeah, we hope to work with community members, like to, to gather that kind of information about what's going on in their own neighborhoods. So like I said, all of our bird atlas data was volunteer collected. And so we'd like to expand that to other communities and more diverse communities, definitely. Yeah.
Another question. So the message kind of seems to be rural areas are significantly worse than urban areas for birds, kind of, right? And would you agree with that? And then do you have thoughts about, sort of why?
Yeah.
That might be?
Yeah, so I think the takeaway is seasonally rural areas have a bigger effect on birds because we see that like strong shift towards the negative slopes in the winter. And I think a lot of that has to do with, well, honestly, a lot of that has to do with effort, survey effort, because the northern corners of the state are less populated and therefore there's just less birders per capita or less people who are willing to put in that effort to go out and survey for birds. So a big issue we've had to deal with is just accounting for how number of hours at a survey block might inflate the species that we're seeing there. Another hypothesis we have is that the coastal areas are just more species rich by nature. So just the location of the farmed areas might play a role in that. We have a lot of ideas and we haven't really figured it out yet. Cool. Any more questions? Then I'm going to attach my train. Thank you.
Looking for your last name. What else is there? Sorry. Picture. You got 1 minute. I'll be there.
Okay, we'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Jin Bai.
Yes.
Yay. Okay, Jin Bai on the ecological legacy effects of redlining on urban landscapes and bird diversity in Durham, North Carolina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jin Bai from NC State University. This is one of the chapters of my thesis focusing on legacy effects of redlining on birds. I'm kind of surprised actually so many people at the end of the conference. So here is the Durham city limits on the right and where Durham is in relation to North Carolina. Probably by this time, you have heard redlining many times throughout the conference. It's a residential segregation policy employed by the homeowner loan corporation in the 1930s. This map showing the many US cities that were redlined, approximately 143 cities. Most of the redline area are categorized into 4 from A to D, A representing best, B still desirable, C definitely declining the hazardous. So this is the redlining map for Durham. It's a relatively smaller area. If you go back to the map, the side of the circle shows the area that was redlined, and Durham's relatively small in comparison. And I just thought it would be interesting to post some original documents. So the A5 is representing this area, which is the higher graded neighborhoods, and D6 was the red line areas. And based on the description from the original documents, you can see that in the A5 area, they are mostly high income, no African-American residents. And you can see there's some favorable influence like public parks in the area, versus in a D6, you got more low-income residents, mostly African-American. And in the detrimental influences, you see there's industrial area that being in the neighborhood. So my first question is to see if the redlining has an effect in terms of the landscape before moving on to birds. This diagram you may also have seen many times. I'm gonna look into 3 of the layers. First is the canopy cover. So what you're seeing here is a map of the redlining area overlay with the canopy cover. So this is a high resolution canopy cover at a 1 meter resolution. Using National Land Cover Database, the entire area is pretty much developed. But at this high resolution, you can see some differences. And the canopy cover percentage, so I overlay with a grid, which is 100 meter by 100 meter grid, and calculating the percentage of forest cover. And the difference between each category is significant for each pair, meaning A is higher than B, B is higher than C, C is higher than D. I also look at impervious surface. This one is a polygon layer from the Durham government open data. It's also high resolution. Comparing to the canopy cover, there may not be as an obvious pattern by just looking at it. And the difference is quite minimum. So the only significant comparison was that the impervious surface cover is significantly lower in A compared to C and D, versus B is no difference between. And the difference in comparison to canopy cover is not as drastic. I also look into urban heat island effect. So this is a data source that would measure from this urban heat island temperature mapping campaign for Raleigh and Durham. It was measured on July 23rd, 2021. There were people measuring temperature all over the city in the morning, afternoon, and night. This is one example of that, of the map showing the afternoon temperature. As you can see, the temperature of the urban heat island effects are unevenly distributed. Some area are cooler than the other. In this example, the difference can be 8 degrees in Fahrenheit. And the pattern is very similar to the canopy cover, which is also very drastic difference in terms of the temperature. This one I'm showing is the sort of early evening, late afternoon temperature, 7 to 8 p.m., showing that difference is also significantly increased as you go from A to D. And the pattern is still true for early afternoon, but not so much in the morning. So now we know that redlining did have an effect on especially canopy cover and urban heat island effect, which are both highly correlated. What does it mean for birds? So in order to understand the bird species richness and abundance, I first mapping all the city parks within the area and using city parks as my study sites, randomly generating a survey point within the park. Bigger parks will get more survey points based on that category. I also have 2 rural sites just for comparison. This one is at a nearby nature preserve, and This is the second one. So for my data collection protocol, I visit those sites during the breeding season and non-breeding season in June 2022 and from December 2022 to February this year. I had a repeat visits, 3 visits per each sampling point. I count birds both seen and heard within the 40 meters radius, excluding flyovers. I also looking at just native birds and just seasonal birds and year-round birds. So seasonal birds are birds can be only observed in central North Carolina during certain months of the year, such as great crested flycatcher, white-eyed vireo in the summer, or hermit thrush in the winter, versus year-round birds like the blue jay, eastern towhee, and red-bellied woodpecker can be seen throughout the year. And I have 2 types of model. So for the overall species richness and abundance at a given site, I use linear mixed effect models. The response is either the species richness or abundance. And the predictors are the site representing the 3 categories. So I combine the A-B zone together because it's a relatively small area. So the site is the A-B zone or CD zone or a rural site. And then have canopy impervious surface at the 100-meter buffer percentage. I also have a measurements on stream, which is the distance to closest stream, with a random effect at the site ID level because I have a repeat visits, and then using model selection to pick the best model. On the second part of the model is a binomial unmixture model. Because I have these repeat visits, I can account for detection probability. So the state process is the N representing true abundance, followed by a Poisson distribution. So I'll be estimating lambda, which is the mean and variance, depends on the same set of predictors. In addition, there's also the observation process, which follows a binomial distribution, accounting for detection probability, and those measurements including weather, temperature, wind, and noise affecting detection. And all this model will be running at each foraging guild. So the foraging guild that I use using this categorization, not all of the birds are common throughout my study sites. So I'm only focusing on 10 of them. So there are 2 from granivores, the seed eaters, and 6 from insectivores, 2 from omnivores, but I separate the non-native species as a special interest, and a ground forager omnivores. So I will right into the result on redlining effect first. So this is the effects comparing to the CD zone comparing to AB zone. On the left, the table shows all the models that I run. So in the top, you have the linear mixed effect model looking at the species richness overall and abundance. And then at the bottom is the foraging guild models. And whenever you see a mark, that's when redlining has an effect. As you can notice directly, there's no significant effect from the overall species richness or abundance. Even only looking at native birds or seasonal birds or year-round birds, they're all similar. However, there are some patterns for specific foraging guilds. As you can see, the orange marks indicating positive effect, meaning more birds in the CD zone. That is true for insectivore ground foragers like American robin, eastern bluebirds, and it's also true for non-native species across both breeding season and non-breeding season, in which case the most common non-native species in Durham is European starling. That's why I use that image. Rarely I get house sparrow and very uncommon rock pigeons. So overall, there's more of a positive effect. The only negative effect was during the non-breeding season on insectivore lower canopy gleaner, which are ruby crown kinglets, golden crown kinglets, Trichis, titmice. So that was the only one showing the negative effect from redlining. There's also some pattern in terms of the rural sites comparing to those 2 urban park sites. During the breeding season, there's effect on only the seasonal birds, which also kind of makes sense that the more less disturbed natural habitat supporting more like migratory birds. But interestingly, during the non-breeding season, the rural sites consistently showing lower species richness and abundance. I think there could be an explanation that if you were to walk the entire nature preserve, you probably will find more birds. But because all my points are randomly generated, so in that process, the urban parks actually has more birds, both species richness and abundance. So I also have some interesting finding in terms of the tree canopy cover. The first thing to notice is that it's only significant during the breeding season. It never affects the non-breeding season. And most of the effect are actually negative. And you heard it right, it's a negative canopy effect. So from the top two figures, it shows that tree canopy decreased both species richness and abundance. And on the lower two figures, showing one example of non-native species like the European starling negatively responding to canopy cover, and has this kind of interesting curve that it drastically decreased their abundance as you reach about over 30 to 40%, and pretty much zero abundance as you pass the 50% canopy cover. And the only species responding positively to canopy cover was the insectivore air hawkers, the flycatcher birds. Impervious surface was also having an effect. Most of them are negative as expected. Two examples are on the right, insectivore lower canopy forager, and the insectivore bark cleaner like nuthatches, they all respond negatively, as well as the overall species richness. The only positive response was coming from the omnivore ground forager in the case of common grackles or blue jays, crows. They responding positively to impervious surface as well as the non-native species. Distance to stream wasn't a very important factor, but it actually showed up only once, was also affecting the omnivore ground foragers, meaning that there's a higher abundance of omnivore ground foragers when the site is closer to a stream. So in summary, what I found is there's a very strong redlining effect in terms of the tree canopy and urban heat island effect, intermediate redlining effect on impervious surface, mostly in comparison from A to CD zone. Somewhat limited redlining effect on the ecological process in terms of bird species richness and abundance, which I did not observe, but it was only affecting certain group of birds. Yeah, thank you.
Time for questions.
Yes.
And it's really cool. So do you think maybe your groups captured this, but if you grouped it by like tree nesting species or something that was a little bit more in line with like what you're seeing with the habitat stuff, do you think the results would shift around or?
It might, yeah, I could definitely try that, yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
That was interesting that you had like probably opposite of what you hypothesized with the impervious cover and the ground foraging birds. Is that what it was?
Yeah, you mean
yeah,
this one?
No, it was almost the end.
Oh,
it was that one. Next one. Yeah, that one gave a positive relationship with the impervious surface.
Yeah.
And since you group them, do you think there's a bird in there that sort of swamps out that data? Because it did have, you said blue jays and grackles and stuff, but is there like a lot of grackles?
I wouldn't necessarily say a lot of them. Probably similar composition, I would say.
So if you're just bumming around in the neighborhoods versus the park, how different does it feel from the D to the A area? If you're just walking down the street.
Especially in terms of the parks, as I was visiting those parks, one thing to notice is that there's less people in the redlining area. Like the parks, basically, when I visit them, I'm the only person in the entire park. Versus the AB parks typically have more people walking, children playing. That could have an influence on the birds. But neighborhood-wise, not too much of a difference, I would say.
What's up with the really tight points on like some of these figures? It seems like it's like predicting so perfectly, I don't trust it. Basically,
Yeah,
that looks scary to me.
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to find a way to visualizing the results at like a predicted lambda is on the y-axis, and they just somehow fits perfectly with the line. I don't know exactly why it first fits perfectly. Yeah.
So that's not species richness then. That's like the one on the bottom left is species richness, and the one on the right is something different then.
Yeah, so that's a specific group of birds.
Okay.
Their abundance, predicted abundance.
All on your own.
No, I didn't turn it on.
It's out.
Where was it? Almost similar.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, time to start. This will be our final presentation. Best for last, right? Okay, Eric Wood is going to present on the effects of the effects of over a century of urbanization on the avifauna of the Los Angeles basin. Sorry about that.
It's fine. There's people here. I thought, given the last talk, there would be like maybe 4 people here. So thank you so much for being here. And what I'm going to do today, it's going to be a little storytelling, kind of. There's going to be some analysis on this for sure. But this is part of a much broader and bigger historical ecology of LA project that we're working on. We've got a cultural aspect. We're looking at land cover and vegetation and all that. And then we're doing the biodiversity thing, the wildlife thing, and that's where the birds come in. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors. I'm not going to read all their names or their affiliations down here, but you can see them. But I do want to give a shout out to the Haynes Foundation for funding this research. So quaint little LA. I just want to start with talking about the rapid ascent of Los Angeles. This is Los Angeles in the 1890s. This is downtown LA. Note that you can see the early formation of the grids. There's some agriculture going on. You can kind of get a sense that things are starting to change in the area. That's the LA River moving from left to right. It's not channelized at all. And you can see some of the floodplain there. Some things have changed along that river and in the city. A lot of things have changed, of course, over the 120 years that that photo was taken. And so many things have changed that probably in the 20th century, I would say that LA's had more growth than any other city in the country to be in the iconic city that we know about today. I've been in LA for 8 years or so, and my students and I, we're doing field work all the time. We're out all over. My university, California State University, Los Angeles is right in the middle of the city. And whenever we're out, we're always thinking, there was probably something awesome here, wherever we're doing our surveys right now, whether it was a wetland, whether it was some kind of grassland, and we always think about what used to be out there. And that's what our colleagues were thinking about too, when we were thinking of this bigger, broader historical ecology project. So the simple research goal was just to understand the past distribution of birds throughout greater LA and to see what we've lost and what remains. And today I'm going to talk about, there's 3 papers that are this, and I'm going to talk about like one in a little bit. So there's 3 objectives for this, and you'll note that 2 are in white and 1's kind of grayed out. So what I'm going to cover today is modeling the historical avian community and how we did that. Then I'm going to get into some then and now comparisons, looking at turnover. I'm not done with the homogenization thing, but that's where this is going. So the first paper is like a temporal homogenization project. So just getting right into it, I want to talk about the databases that we're using, because you have to have some pretty cool databases to do some kind of study like this. And I do just want to point out that the reason why this is interesting in thinking about Los Angeles is because of what it looked like in the 1890s. There were still people living there. There's a lot of collection going on. Joseph Grinnell, there's a bunch of people out there collecting like crazy, but there really wasn't much of a city. And that's very different from most cities in this country in terms of going from that rural and landscape and whatever it was to what it is now. Okay, so we had 2 historical databases that we're using. I'm going to talk about these in the next couple of slides, but one was about bird, egg, and nest records. We had a historical land cover database called the Potential Natural Vegetation of LA, which is needed because we were doing some modeling here. And then a contemporary database. It's not that contemporary, 1995 to 1999, but that was good enough for what we needed. So that's the Breeding Bird Atlas. Okay, so I mentioned there was a lot of collecting going on in the LA area in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so we roughly have about 3,000 bird, egg, and nests. Why are egg and nests important? Because it's confirmed breeding. That's really critical for us. And what's cool with all these museum specimen efforts is you can kind of figure out with sort of precision that those nests likely came from a certain area, or these eggs were likely from a certain area. We went with 3 kilometers of uncertainty, so we can generally pinpoint on the landscape where birds were breeding, and that's really important. And if you want to get a sense of what this looked like, this might not make sense to those of you that don't know LA, but it's a lot of those pins. And so we had these specimens from all over. This is a large area that we're talking about here in Greater Los Angeles. So you can see a land cover map that's overlaid on that, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So for historical land cover, we're using this product called the Hypothetical Potential Natural Vegetation of LA that was published by Phil Etherington et al. In 2020. And this is a really cool map over here. You can see all these grids. There are 1 kilometer grids that you have. Don't worry about the land cover types. I know you can't read the legend down there on the bottom. Just note that it's basically covering what we think was on the landscape. And the way that we came up with this, we took elevation and soils and all this kind of interesting biophysical information. We modeled that on the landscape, and then we got a bunch of people in a room, bunch of indigenous scholars, a bunch of ecologists, and we said, what do we think was on the landscape here? So with any one of these grids, we're like 50% sure that that's what the land cover used to look like before European and American settlement. We're also, of course, interested in development. So we have these layers of parcels and when they were built. And it didn't look good when I put it on here. So I just Pasadena, downtown LA, then down into Long Beach. That's where really the development was going on pre-1920. So we basically just overlaid the parcels, erased those from the land cover. So we had a sense of the urban development at the time. And we needed all these data because we had to use these for predictors for what I'm going to get into next in terms of how we recreated the bird community. All right, so our contemporary data, I mentioned we were using the Breeding Bird Atlas or BBA. Just so we're on the same page, some of you might be familiar with the BBA, but it's a population survey project designed to cover large geographic areas. In LA, it's basically like 6 kilometer square grids that people were going into. So from 1995 to 1999, surveyors were visiting grids and they were just looking for anything for birds during the summertime, trying to come up with any kind of breeding behavior by birds. And so I mentioned 1995 to 1999. It's not exactly current, but it doesn't matter because we were just interested in that pre and post development. And we were thinking about this. We're like, let's use eBird, let's use INAT, let's use those cool data sets. But we really needed confirmed breeding because we had that with the historic stuff. So we needed that. And that's why the BBA was best. So how do we link these two together? This is not at all at scale because I told you these were 1 kilometer. And so I just drew this on here just so we can get a sense of what we were doing. We overlaid the BBA data on top of the historical land cover and wherever the bird data are from, those are the blue dots. And we basically just aggregated the bird species, converted them to 0-1 data so we can do some occupancy modeling within the BBA grids. And then we just computed the proportion of the different potential natural vegetation types in that area. So the spatial extent for our study was this collection of 140 breeding bird atlas grids across LA. You're going to see some chunky maps with these grids up here. And so that's just what I want to get you prepared for. Mason might kill me because I'm going to give a very detailed and blow over a lot of the weeds here with the analysis. But we are basically, and another thing, I'll give a shout out to you in your auto logistic models. I learned about this after we did this, so I might have to come back to this. So we were doing some single season occupancy models using data from 1880 to 1920. We did this for 96 species. It's not the whole community, but it's pretty good. And so we were able to predict the extent of 96 species across the LA landscape, where we were going after occupancy. So that was one of the parameters. That's basically the parameter we were most interested in. And that was just a function of the land cover data. We did a dredge process, and I say careful because I went and scrutinized every single model, made sure it made sense. This is kind of a proof of concept thing. We know these habitat associations so well for all these birds. So it's like, yeah, that makes sense. And so we think that's the best fitting model. So for objective 2, the then and now, just showing some results here. So just looking at the differences and the dissimilarity in the bird community from pre and post development. Okay, now I'm going to get to the storytelling part. So I'm going to get into these 2 objectives, the historical avian community and the then and now comparison. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through birds who are indicators of particular ecosystems that were really important in the landscape. And I'm going to show you maps about their historical distribution and their current distribution. And so we can start piecing together what has been lost and what's still sticking around. So first, we're going to focus on a loggerhead shrike, which used to be a common grassland breeding bird throughout LA. This is the prediction from the historical modeling that we were doing with the Nest and Egg records. These birds were positively associated with grassland and coastal sage scrub cover in the area. And when you look at this and when you fit the predictions to the map, these birds are pretty common throughout LA. For those who are not familiar, lowland area, dunes right by LAX, you've probably flown over those dunes there. There used to be a lot of dunes, flower fields. San Fernando Valley, dunes, San Gabriel Valley, a lot of coastal sage scrub, which is intermixed with grassland. And then there's hills in between some of those valleys. These birds used to be pretty common. Any guess on how they're doing right now? Okay, so there's been a big decrease. All these dots is just me calculating the mean proportion of the grid cells that were quote occupied. And then I just put some error bars in there. I'm not going to do this for the paper, but it's just a visual. So you can see there's a big decrease going on here. So about 60% decrease for loggerhead shrike. It's much lower now. This was data, remember, from 30 years ago or so. Why? Why did this happen? So if you look at the San Fernando Valley, then you could see lots of grassland, just tons of grazing going on out here. But if I was a shrike, I'd be chilling right there to go and get whatever prey I wanted. What does it look like now? Your suburban dream, where you can sit in your car and drive to work for 2 hours on the freeway and then drive home or do whatever you need to do. And that's really how we kind of developed Los Angeles. We definitely paved over a lot of these lowland areas. Look at all the trees that are there. Those trees were definitely not there before. All right, how about a wetland bird? So I group in tricolored blackbird with yellow-headed blackbird. Nice positive association with freshwater marshes and lakes. These birds were common where the LA River opened up. Once you got past the Elysian Valley, there was definitely freshwater marshes there. Or when you started getting into low areas of the San Gabriel River, which that really is the river in LA that you guys need to know about, the San Gabriel River. But there was definitely these birds in those areas back in the day. How are they doing now? We didn't see much change when we were just doing like a little chi-square analysis and just comparing then and now, because there still are some managed wetlands throughout the area. Their distribution is different in terms of the cells that are blinking on, but their numbers aren't very different. There's no tricolored blackbirds, so this is mainly just yellow-headed blackbirds. Why? Well, this is an image of Ballona Wetlands, which is a real famous wetland area in West LA. And I tried to find the picture where this person was standing, the exact one. I don't know if I did it, but there's still managed wetlands in certain places in Los Angeles.
Okay, moving on, riparian birds, yellow-billed cuckoo. This was definitely an awesome bird in the western riparian areas, all the way down the LA River. The Arroyo Seco, the San Gabriel River. These birds were there for sure. And so we had nice eggs and nests for them. Any guess on how they're doing? Goose eggs, nothing, you know, in this area. They're completely gone, completely extirpated. And if you want to know why, if you say, okay, there's this gallery forest that used to be all these nice alders, sycamore, willow, that we could see a nice yellow-billed cuckoo nesting in there. And what does it look like now when you look at all the LA riverways? It's completely channelized. For those of you that aren't familiar with LA, we're ringed by huge mountains. So in the wintertime, you get all these storms that come off the Pacific. There's all that orographic uplift and boom, the mountains just get pounded with rain and whoosh, that stuff just comes right down in the valleys. And so it's tough to build a city when you're getting flooding like that. So they channelize it, get the water out to the ocean as much as possible, bring water in from Northern California to replace all that stuff so everybody can take showers and water their lawn or whatever. I didn't make it up. That's just what they came up with. Okay, so Anna's hummingbird. Let's look at this. Kind of a little bit of a weird model, but I was trying to find a woodland bird to show you this. In the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains, getting up in the San Gabriel Mountains. How's this bird doing right now? Anybody that knows LA? They're everywhere, you know. So some of these birds are all over the place. So we're starting to piece together this thing that it's not just everything going down right now. There's some things that are starting to go up here. So a big increase, and this is a native bird that needs woodland areas. This is Olive Avenue in Burbank. Olive Avenue is not famous at all, but Burbank is because that's where all the movie studios are. So if you look at it then, and then now on Olive Avenue, you're seeing all your trees. There's some coast live oaks. I was looking for those because Anna's hummingbirds love to nest in coast live oaks. And then you got exotic shrubs everywhere. They're going to come down and take a drink on some nectar or do whatever they're going to need to do. So the urban forest has been really important for a lot of birds that kind of need those trees. Last one to show you here, synanthropic birds that are affiliated with people or associated with people. We're going to go after the hooded oriole. Big time positive correlation with urban areas or the parcels. Downtown LA back in the day, and then up into Pasadena, that's where you'd find these birds. Now they're all over the place. And of course, the synanthropic species have just taken off all over. They cover everything in this. Why? Well, here's Figueroa Street, a real famous street in LA. They would go from downtown to Northeast LA. Look at these nice palm trees. That's where a hooded oriole wants to breed. But this was in a relatively small area back in 1890. And now, of course, when we think of LA, we think of palm trees, and this just goes on all over the place. So birds like that, they've got habitat. So they're going to do fine and breed in that area. So if we're just looking at, this is kind of washed out, but just an ordination, if we're just looking at the historical and contemporary, there's been just total turnover in the bird communities here. So just to summarize some of this stuff and what we're seeing here. So of course our valley, yep, sounds good, thanks. Our valley ecosystems, our grasslands and our riparian zones, they've just been decimated, totally decimated, and all the wildlife that would be in those areas. Some of either ecosystems still persist, but there's problems with invasive plants, especially in our grassland areas, urban pressures, pollution, runoff in our riverways that are going to impede recovery. Our marsh systems are hammered, but there's some evidence that birds will still return to those areas and existing wetlands. I'm not going to say the whole, if you build it, they will come. I'm not going to do that. But the woodland birds, if you're looking at this, they likely persist in some areas due to that extensive urban forest, and then the synanthropes have taken off. So what does this mean? From a conservation implication, those restricted range birds, it's hard, but you know, if you put down a freshwater marsh, some might use the area, not all of them are going to come back. Any work to focus on our riparian areas, that's the big deal in LA. We're doing some work in the LA River right now, counting birds, and there are places where they just put in a bunch of mature, well, they're not mature when they plant them, but now they're mature trees, riparian habitat. There's Leafspells vireos, there's yellow-breasted chats, there's good stuff in there. So it can work. So these urban forests likely play a crucial role, but I want to make a point down here. My thinking on this has changed a lot. We've done a lot of research on urban forests and the importance of native trees and all that stuff to birds, but it's not really a panacea for birds in cities in arid environments. And I say that because you must think about native shrubs and grasses. And you look at this map, those maps of the ecosystem types, there are different non-treed ecosystems all over LA that a lot of the wildlife would depend on. Okay, I got to wrap up. So our next steps. This is the paper. This paper is this homogenization paper. We're also doing one. We do some redlining stuff. That was a really great talk by Jen. So we're looking at how things have changed for this historical map over time and see if redlining and everything has changed the trajectory of birds over time. And then there's a cultural aspect of this too, in terms of indigenous village sites, avian communities, birds that were culturally important to indigenous peoples, and how the parallel idea of those being lost and then culture being lost as well. Okay, I got to do one thing. We had a colleague who passed away recently, Nat Zapia. I don't know if some of you may have known him. I might get a little emotional because he was a really good friend of mine. And he passed away recently. He's got kids and everything. So this one's kind of for him. All right, thanks. And Nat was a really big person on this project too. And so it's really surprising for us. Yeah, dude.
Eric, thank you for that. It's a great talk. That's a really nice. That is an awesome project. I love the comprehensiveness of that and the long-term focus. What's your prediction on 100 years from now?
Well, okay, so there's a couple things going on in LA. There's a ton of money there, and it's also been really ruined. And a lot of people know that. And so there's a lot of money in trying to bring things back. And I always tell my students, you know, we've got preservation, we've got restoration, and obviously you want to preserve if you can, but we can't go there in LA. But there is a lot of money being poured into like greening some of the riverways, improving park access in certain parts of the city. So I think it's going to get better there. I think that's really one of the only ways we can go. And that's like the entire purpose of my lab, is trying to help that and doing like kind of applied research to help that out. I think it's getting better. There's some short-term things where they're going to pump and infuse a lot of money for like the Olympics. That's going to happen. They want to have all those shots of LA looking green and kind of cool. And so they're trying. So people know about it for sure. It's just a really steep mountain to climb. Yeah, Mason.
Have you thought to look to see what traits relate to these species that you can use to predict why they've gone up, down, to kind of help form the narrative?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that I tend to do with all these is once I have these community things, I always kind of group certain birds by traits or habitats and see some of the stuff they're doing. And so that is a little bit of this analysis, but it's a great thing to be thinking about. Anybody else? Yeah.
More of an abstract question, and you talked about kind of the cultural significance of birds, species that have not done so well. The species that have increased and are really common now, do you think people today have a cultural association with those species, and would they be upset if the landscape was kind of re-engineered to restore what it used to be, and you don't see maybe those palm species so much?
This is actually an interesting point. Okay, so those hooded orioles, people actually really kind of like them. They'll nest in your backyard, and yeah. It's one of the only like neotropical Nearctic birds that actually migrates to Los Angeles and breeds within the city, outside of like the riparian zones. And so you can actually find them in your backyard. There's really not much else. But we're losing palms. There's a palm weevil that's wiping out a lot of the palms, and the city is not replacing them. And there's a big debate about it because it's iconic. That's what people think of LA with the palm trees. But they want to plant more jacarandas and all these trees that they think are going to be better, more climate resilient, and potentially have more services like shade. And so there are going to be some shifts like that where some species are potentially going to move a little bit. I don't think you're the average kind of, thinking about it is really, we might lose these birds, but eventually that's going to start happening. And so there might be something interesting that could happen there. Maybe not for like a house finch, but for something like an oriole, when you just see it out in your backyard, something like that might happen. So here first, I'll go to Mason.
But have you thought about this from like an ecosystem services perspective, and like what ecosystem services are lost with homogenization or not, or what might come back?
We actually have a parallel insect analysis. So it's the entire thing is about ecosystem services and a lot of the services that insects provide. And certainly that's like, there's those cool like trait papers that have just come out, like what makes an urban bird urban. And we kind of like have already been eyeing some of those traits that people, I think like Monty Clegg wrote about this recently from UCLA. You want to look at that, we haven't done it yet, but I think it's kind of cool thinking about it from a services point of view. Because when you think of all like the synanthropes that you're going to find in the middle of town, like seed-eating birds, like house finches, and then you have some other birds like, I don't know, starlings, I'm not really sure what they provide. And so you're just not going to get the same level of services that you would get in, some more natural areas, like in some of those riparian zones. It's a good question. It's a good thing to be thinking about. Nice.
So I just want to see if this is happening to you as well. So in some of my own research in Chicago, like I've been constantly surprised that people are not taking advantage of egg collections that people get at the Field Museum, for example, or any natural history museum. Is that something that you're surprised in LA as well, or is it like people are like regularly tapping into stuff like this?
Well, you're a big inspiration for this, and like some of the stuff that you guys are doing, but it is. So the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology has one of the largest egg and nest collections in the world. They're in Camarillo, California, kind of like in between Santa Barbara and LA. And they approached us saying, we have like this amazing data set from all over. Like, what are you boneheads doing? Use it. You know, like there's a bunch of cool things you could potentially do with it. And I didn't even know it existed. So I wonder if there's just things where people don't know because a lot of these records are from like the Field Museum.
Yeah.
And so if you guys can get in touch with your whatever museums that you can, there's probably some really interesting information that you can get out of them, because if you can figure out that historical baseline, any of these change analyses get way cooler when you can start looking at how things have changed over time, which is interesting. So yeah. Anybody else? Thanks. Oh, wait, one more question.
Kind of in that same realm. Could you use herbaria to, instead of using the predictive model of plant communities, use herbaria to try to know what plant communities were there? If people had made those collections 150 years ago.
I think that's even better, because I think there's probably more herbarium records than that you get. Sorry.
Those were digitized.
Yeah. UCLA's got an insane database all over LA, and you could just go and look at the different plants that are on the river. And that's kind of one of the things that they're doing for like, what should we actually plant here? But to do it across this whole area would be really cool. There's a really interesting redlining analysis where the director of the herbarium at UCLA is walking in all the areas of LA and just looking at whatever weeds they can find. And he's finding that in the red line zones, plants that used to be there, they're finding way more of them than like in kind of the wealthier areas where they're just going to mow and cut and do everything. So it's a really kind of cool historical source of data. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Badass talk.
I didn't. I should have shouted you out because like you were like in this paper.
Yeah.
You're in this side of that. Well, we kind of add some more stuff. But so I find stories. So